Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening. This video, also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Last Halloween, I was stalked by the devil. I was working the closing shift at Footworks, the shoe store crammed into the far corner of the Chapel Hills Mall. Halloween was supposed to be a night of fun, but instead, I was stuck stocking sneakers for minimum wage. I only had a half hour left on my shift, and I could feel the seconds crawling by. The clock on my phone felt frozen at 7:30 p.m. I drummed my fingers on the counter, trying to stay awake. My manager, who was supposed to help close, had ducked out for an early smoke break and never came back. Most of the customers had already thinned out, but there were still a few stragglers wandering around the mall. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my friend Ben. "Ben, yo, you coming tonight or what?" I sighed. I'd been dodging the question all day. Ben's Halloween party was supposed to be the big event of the night. Half of the school was going, including all of my friends. But I hadn't planned on going. After my shift was over, all I really wanted to do was just crash in my bed. I started typing, "Probably not," when another text popped up. "Ben, don't be lame, man, it's Halloween." I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the keyboard. It had been a while since I'd done anything fun, and even though I didn't have a costume, I could probably grab something cheap from the Halloween store on the way. I wasn't exactly Mr. Social, but maybe it wouldn't hurt to get out of the house for once. "Yo," a voice called from the store entrance, breaking my introspection. I looked up and saw Ben and Derek walking into the store like they owned the place. Ben flashed a grin, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Come on, bro. You're not getting out of this one. You're coming tonight," Ben said, leaning against the counter. Derek nodded, smirking. "Yeah, man. You never come to anything. You didn't show up last year either." "Look," I started. "I'm just tired, and I don't even have a costume, and I don't even have time to." "You've got time," Ben interrupted. "The party doesn't start until 10. Grab something cheap and just show up. It's not like you have anything better to do." I sighed. They weren't wrong. As much as I wanted to protest, I started to give in to the pressure. Ben raised an eyebrow, a smirk growing on his face, anticipating my answer. "Fine," I muttered. "I'll come, but I probably won't stay long." "Yes, there he is," Ben grinned, patting me on the shoulder. "You're gonna have a good time, bud, trust me." Derek glanced at his watch. "All right, well, we're heading out. See you there." I watched them leave, their laughter fading as they disappeared out of the mall. I wasn't sure I believed Ben about having a good time, but I was locked in now. I just had to make it through the last stretch of my shift, grab a costume, and then down a few drinks to make the night more tolerable. The mall was basically empty now. Most of the other stores were now closed, and the place began to get a little darker as more and more lights were turned off. I started mentally checking off the closing tasks, sweep the floor, cash out the register. Routine stuff. As I was counting the minutes to clock out, something caught my eye near the entrance. A person stood there, just outside the store, facing me. They were in a Halloween costume, a creepy red latex devil mask, which had a large pointy nose and a cartoonish wide smile which reached ear to ear. Small black horns protruded from the top of the mask. It looked pretty realistic, like one of those expensive movie-quality masks. Had it not been so startling, it would have actually been pretty impressive. The mask was paired with a mismatched black and red suit that looks like it was put together from pieces found at a thrift store. At first, I assumed it was just a last-minute shopper, or someone probably killing time before heading to a party. But they stood completely still, facing me, not moving, not browsing, not shopping, just standing there. I felt my chest tighten. There was no reason to be freaked out by some weirdo in a Halloween costume, but something about them made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The way they were just standing still, watching me, began to eat away at my nerves. I was about to tell him, "We're closed," when he turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. I just stared, frozen in place. His steps were slow, measured, almost robotic as he disappeared out of sight. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath the entire time. What the hell was that about? I thought. Just some creep messing around, probably. It was Halloween, after all. I shook it off, trying to refocus on closing the store and getting out of there. But every few seconds, I found myself glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see that creepy guy in a devil mask there again, watching me. By the time I finally clocked out, I was beat, and my nerves were shot. I made my way out of the now empty mall toward my car, checking behind my shoulder every few seconds. I safely made it to my car, now fully convinced that the person, whoever it was simply messing around with me. I brushed off the feeling and headed to the Halloween store to pick up a costume for the party. The Halloween store was one of those pop-up stores that showed up every year, taking over abandoned sporting goods stores and the like. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, a chime ringing loudly in the nearly empty store. The place was a mess. Shelves were mostly empty now, and decorations were scattered all the floor, with a few straggling shoppers picking over the scraps. The sound of Halloween music played faintly through the speakers. I wandered aimlessly, searching for any scraps of a costume. The aisles were nearly bare, but I kept looking, feeling the pressure of time build. Suddenly, the music cut off, leaving the store in an uncomfortable silence. I knew I didn't have much time before they closed, so I hurried, eyes darting over the shelves. The door chimed again. Someone else had come in, but I didn't bother to look. I was too focused. At the end of one aisle, I found a small rack with cheap knockoff masks of famous movie killers. I grabbed a plastic Jason-style mask headed for the register, rushing to get out. As I turned the corner, my heart lurched. There he was, the man in the devil mask. He stood at the far end of the aisle, illuminated by the dim, flickering light. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. My stomach twisted and my throat went dry. No fucking way, I thought, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. He stood perfectly still, just staring. For a split second, I considered throwing the mask down and bolting, but something kept me rooted. Maybe it was disbelief, maybe shock. I told myself it was a coincidence, forcing my legs to carry me to the front. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as I approached, too busy scrolling through his phone. My skin crawled as I sensed the man in the devil mask moving closer, his eyes locked on me. I could feel it, the weight of his stare, boring into me. "Just this," I muttered, tossing the cheap mask onto the counter. It felt so pointless, but at least I wouldn't show up to Ben's party without something. The cashier rang it up slowly, the beeps of the register cutting through the heavy silence. I kept my head down, resisting the urge to look back, but I knew he was still watching me. "That'll be $10.53, the cashier said, snapping his gum, finally glancing up at me. I handed him the crumpled bills, my hand shaking slightly as I grabbed the change and shoved the mask into a bag. Without another word, I made a quick escape toward the exit. The bell chimed again as I pushed through the door, and the cold night air hit me like a splash of water. I exhaled sharply, tension easing from my shoulders. Instinctively, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him, the man in the devil mask, standing at the entrance, following me still. But there was nothing. Just the empty store and a couple of people loitering on the sidewalk. He was gone. Again. I shook my head and got in my car. I kept reminding myself, it's Halloween. Creepiness was just part of it. And besides, I had bigger things to worry about, like not making an idiot of myself at Ben's party. By the time I got to Ben's place, the party was already in full swing. Cars were parked up and down the block, and I could hear the bass from the music thumping before I even stepped out of my car. The house was decorated to the nines, fake cobwebs hanging from the trees, jack-o'-lanterns lining the walkway, and orange lights flickering in the windows. I could hear Rob Zombie's Dragula blasting from inside the house. I pulled the plastic hockey mask out of the bag and slipped it over my face. It wasn't much, but it would do. I didn't feel like going all out for this party anyway. I just wanted to blend in, have a few drinks, and hopefully avoid any awkward moments with people. The front door was wide open, and people were spilling out into the yard, already tipsy and laughing too loud. I stepped inside, and the smell of beer and sweat hitting me immediately. Ben's living room was packed. People in costumes, some elaborate and some as half-assed as mine, dancing, drinking, and yelling over the blaring music. "Hey, you actually came!" Ben appeared out of nowhere, clapping me on the back hard enough to nearly knock me over. He was wearing a vampire costume, complete with fake blood dripping from his mouth. "Yeah, well, you didn't really give me a choice," I said jokingly, raising my voice to be heard over the music. "Here, grab a drink," Ben shouted, shoving a plastic cup of beer into my hand before I could protest. "We're playing beer pong in the kitchen. Come on." I hesitated. Beer pong wasn't really my thing, but it was better than standing around awkwardly in the corner. "Sure, yeah, why not?" I followed him into the kitchen, where a crowd had gathered around a table lined with orange plastic cups. Someone had set up a fog machine, and the room was filled with swirling white mist, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I took a swig of beer and tried to relax. It was just a party, after all. We played several rounds. The beer had begun to do its job with loosening me up, and I was actually starting to have fun. For a moment, I even began to question myself on why I didn't come out more. But just as that thought occurred, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The figure, that devil mask, that long, pointy nose and wide smile. He was standing in the living room, just beyond the edge of the crowd, perfectly still like he had been at the store. He didn't move or try to talk to anyone. He just stood there watching me. My throat went dry, and my stomach twisted into knots. What the hell was he doing here? How did he follow me here? I blinked, half expecting him to disappear like a trick of the light. But when I looked again, he was still there. He raised his hand and gave me a slow, taunting wave, and turned to leave. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe it was the feeling of security from the crowd. But anger began to boil up inside me. I set my drink down and pushed through the crowd, trying to keep him in sight. I wanted to grab him and find out who he was and why the hell he was following me. But by the time I reached the living room, he was gone. Just like that. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. People were laughing, talking, and dancing like nothing was wrong. I thought about telling Ben, but what could I say? That some weirdo in a devil mask had been following me around all night? He'd just think I was being paranoid. I needed to calm down. I told myself it was just some guy playing a prank, maybe someone who had been at the mall earlier and recognized me. Or maybe it was someone I knew just messing with me. It was Halloween. People were supposed to be creepy. I grabbed another beer, took a long drink, and forced myself to relax. It was just in my head. It's nothing to worry about. I didn't stay at the party long after that. After a couple more beers and some awkward small talk, I made my excuses and slipped out. I just wasn't in the mood anymore. All I could think about was that guy. Every time I turned around, I expected to see him and his devil mask, standing there, just watching. It was a relief to get back to my car and leave the noise and chaos behind. The streets were quiet as I drove home, the occasional group of teenagers in costumes still wandering the sidewalks. My parents' house was only a few blocks away, and when I pulled into the driveway, everything seemed peaceful. The porch light was on, and the pumpkins were lit on the front porch. I parked and walked up the front steps, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door. The quiet was almost comforting after the noise of the party. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. They had probably gone to bed already. I flipped on the hallway light and headed for the stairs, planning to just crash in my room and forget about the whole night. But something stopped me. A sound. A drip. A slow, steady drip. Not the drip of a sink, a heavier, thicker drip. Slowly, I made my way toward the sound in the direction of the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes scanned around the house. As I got closer to the kitchen, the sound got louder, and there was something else, a smell, an odd smell, almost like copper, thick in the air. I rounded the corner into the kitchen when I saw the outline of something. No, not something. Someone. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was my dad. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and so was my mom. Only something was wrong. They were sitting at the table, side by side, like they had been waiting for me. But there was something horribly wrong. So wrong that it took my brain a moment to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Their heads were gone. The jagged, red stumps of their necks were all that remained, blood streaking down their clothes, pooling onto the floor. The table, once warm and familiar, was now soaked in it. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stood frozen, in shock, every muscle locked in place as my brain struggled to process the nightmare in front of me. At first, I wasn't able to comprehend if what I was seeing was real or some twisted hallucination. And then I saw him. The man, the devil, was standing in the corner, almost blending into the shadows. He was big, much bigger up close, and his posture was unnervingly calm. In each hand he held a head, their heads by the hair, the thick strands twisted around his fingers. In his hands I saw the source of the sound. Blood dripped from their severed heads, landing on the tile floor with a soft, rhythmic plip. Plip, plip. The sound was horrible, and for a moment all I could hear was the sound of the dripping and my own heartbeat. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, perfectly still. His arms were reached up toward me, holding my parents' heads proudly, like two trophies. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in fear. I slowly backed away, step by step, my eyes never leaving him. His head didn't turn, his body didn't shift. He just stared, with that pointy nose, that huge red smile, as if he were frozen in time. I kept moving backward, my chest tightening with every inch I gained. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran was the man still standing there in the corner, heads dangling from his hands, utterly motionless, his cold eyes boring into me. He never moved, and somehow, that was worse. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers barely worked as I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator what had happened. When the police arrived, the house was empty. The man, the devil, was gone. They never found him. The police chalked it up to some kind of gruesome home invasion. But I knew the truth. He had been following me the whole night, maybe longer, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. He had wanted me to see, to know. He chose me for some reason. That was last Halloween, when my life was forever changed. I'm terrified he is going to come back for me this Halloween. I'm terrified that at any moment, I'm going to see that mask again. If you thought that was chilling, the next story will freeze your blood. We heard a voice, then my stepsister got stuck. My stepdad, Carl, hates me. There's just no other way to put it. Matt, if you don't like it, go and live with your dad. Carl would yell, squinting at me through his wire-rimmed glasses, arms folded. I don't know where he is, though. I don't know him. He left when I was 7. I'd reply, that's not my problem, is it? I'm the breadwinner in this household, so if you want to live here, you'll do as I say. The chore schedule is strict. Sweeping, doing the dishes, washing the car, dusting, vacuuming. Invariably, Carl would find some fault with the quality of my work and call a house meeting to make clear that the piece of gravel he found on the kitchen floor was not acceptable. Had I even done the chores at all? Or was I lying? My mom would sit there, eyes downcast, letting him get through his spiel. Evie, his daughter, my stepsister, would hover by the doorway, waiting to dash out of the room when he'd had his say. I learned long ago that there is no way to win the argument, so I'm deferential and apologize and say it'll never happen again. But it will. When he's out at his job as a mobile mechanic, I say as much to my mom, and she's well aware. He has his flaws, but he's practical, and in his heart he's good. He's been the closest thing you've had to a father, Matt. He took that responsibility when he didn't have to. She'd say soothingly, in your heart, you're good, but you don't treat Evie like he treats me. I'd respond, Evie has a mother who shares the burden. It isn't my fault my dad ran away. That's how the conversation goes. Around and around in circles. In fairness, my stepdad can be a dick to Evie too. He restricts our internet access. He doesn't let us have sugary snacks. He makes us lock our phones away in a cupboard at 9 p.m. sharp and sends us to bed. He bangs on the bathroom door if he deems we've been in the shower too long. As a result, Evie and I have bonded. The austere rules push us together, and we've got a genuine friendship. She appreciates that I'm more hard done by, so she'll smuggle me biscuits and tell me the Wi-Fi password if she's managed to weasel the information out of Carl. Needless to say, the rules are subject to a degree of flexibility. He buys chocolate biscuits and Doritos for himself and can munch a whole bag in a night, spilling crumbs over the sofa he's sprawled out on. I can hear the TV blaring till midnight sometimes, the drone being broken only by his guffaws. Strict and baleful as he has never laid a finger on any of us. Instead, he smashes objects and writes notes in a capitalized font on the back of envelopes for me to discover in a morning. He screams and shouts in my face, sending the sour stench of his breath my way. I wonder if he's trying to provoke me to hit him, which would be absurd. He's pushing 2 meters tall and heavy-set, and I'm a skinny 17-year-old who's far more interested in reading about battles than fighting them. I'm used to his dramatic outbursts now, so that's why yesterday was so weird. Carl was trying to fix the pipes under the kitchen sink, while Evie pressed him for extra pocket money. He was grumbling and largely ignoring her until she mentioned something about the chest in the basement. Carl stopped his tinkering and slid out from under the counter. He towered over Evie, ominously silent. I was studying at the kitchen table, but stopped to watch. Carl's face, usually so snarling and pained when he was angry, was utterly blank. "What did you say?" he whispered. I was just joking. I said I could sell that old chest in the basement to get some pocket money. I'll say this once, Evie, you leave my chest alone. His eyes, cold as frozen planets, bore into Evie's for a moment longer. Then he went back to work. Evie left the room, sobbing. I followed her up to her bedroom, where she was crying into one of her old teddies. I thought I'd be doing him a favor. It's full of his army clothes. People buy that sort of stuff nowadays, don't they? And it'd clear some space. I was trying to be nice. I put my arm around her. "I know, Evie," I said. 2 years younger than me and less beaten down, Evie's heart was more open to assault. Still, the coldness of Carl's fury had shocked me. "Fuck him! Fuck him! Fuck him!" she screamed into her teddy. "Say, Evie, shall we see what's in Carl's chest tonight? 3 a.m.? She looked at me with vengeful, red-rimmed eyes and nodded. I played on her heightened emotions a little, I'll admit, but the way Carl reacted had me genuinely worried about what he had in that chest. If it was anything that could endanger my mom or Evie, I had to know. The evening passed. Evie and I completed our chores, and I read for an hour before surrendering my mobile phone. I said goodnight to Carl and my mom, and only got one response. It's not worth pointing out who ignored me and who replied. I climbed the stairs and closed my bedroom door. It was far too early to sleep, despite what Carl thought, so I read by lamplight every night until my eyes got tired. The only thing to be wary of were slow creaking noises that might indicate Carl was creeping up the stairs. Reading in bedrooms was also banned, and publicly, neither me nor Evie did it. However, Carl had his suspicions, so he'd climb with stealth to a certain point on the stairs to check for a glow beneath either of our bedroom doors. If he saw light, he'd burst into the room hoping to catch us. Therefore, I'd preemptively switch off the lamp and pretend to be asleep at the sound of any unusual noise. Once a military man, always a military man, I guess. Carl had spent a decade in the army as an engineer. He'd been deployed multiple times, but never to an active theater of war. Bowing to his ex-wife's demands, he'd returned to civilian life a year after Evie's birth. Everything I'd been able to glean seemed to indicate Carl had enjoyed his time in the military. The problem is that he never talks about it. He smiles absently, and his eyes go somewhere far away. What had he seen? What had he done? I woke to a gentle tapping at the door. It was time. "Follow my steps," Evie whispered. She'd charted the least creaky path down the stairs, it seemed. We reached the stone slabs of the kitchen floor and gently opened the basement door, careful of squealing hinges. I closed the door behind us and turned on the flickering light. Pressing against the dusty, cobweb-ridden walls, we descended. The basement itself was cramped and filled with tools, shelves, bicycles, shoes, boxes. Evie pulled a picnic blanket off of a bulky mass to reveal a mahogany chest that was curiously dust-free. "He comes down here most nights, you know," she said. "Why?" Evie shrugged and nudged a coded padlock. "Shit, do you know the code?" I said. "Maybe," Evie said before twisting 4 numbers into the padlock. It clicked open. "Ha, Dad's army serial number. It's full of army crap, so I assumed that'd be it." "How do you know it's full of army crap?" I asked. "He told me once, duh, or at least I think he did. Let's open it and find out." The lid was heavier than we expected. It was 4 inches thick and must have been full of lead. I heaved at one side and Evie heaved at the other until we got it up. Inside there were no combat fatigues, no dog tags, no boots. It was empty, except for two objects, a long black cushion and a human jawbone. Who's there? Evie and I stared at each other, then back at the jawbone. Boy? Girl? Speak. Can you hear a voice? I asked Evie. Yeah. This isn't army stuff. I don't know what this is. I heard a hollow laugh before the voice continued. He wouldn't have told you about me, his charnel confidant. Such is his shame, for he slew me long ago upon a field far from here. I don't like it. Evie said. Who killed you? I asked the bone. Her father. My dad wouldn't kill anyone. That's a lie. Evie wailed. Shh, you'll wake them, I whispered. I don't like this. He comes here every night to pray and beg and weep, just as his spawn does. He's certain it was an accident, a firing range mishap, nothing more. Do you believe him? Might he do it again? I hate this, Evie said, and went to close the lid, but I held her back, chewing my lip. Are we in danger? I asked, and that chilly laugh rattled through my head again. Evie broke my grip and lunged for the jawbone, perched on the black cushion. You dare to touch me. The chest had slammed shut on Evie's right arm, halfway along the bicep, shattering the bone. She let out half a scream before passing out and sliding down the side of the chest. A grisly grinding sound came from her trapped arm as it twisted further. A cold sweat burst out all over my body, and I sprang into action, heaving Evie back up from where she'd fallen. Let her out! Let her out! The voice had ceased to reply. Summoning all my strength, I squatted down and pressed the lid up. It didn't budge. I adjusted my grip and pushed with everything I had. A dark centimeter grew into 2, then 3, then 4. I glimpsed that grinning bone perched on black velvet before Evie's mangled arm was free, and she slid back onto the basement floor. I let the lid thud shut. I helped her up the basement stairs, fully intending to wake my mom and Carl up because Evie needed to go to hospital. She was delirious and muttering. When we emerged, she looked at me, her face white as chalk. Run up the stairs. I was sleepwalking. I fell, she said. It took me a moment to realize what she was doing. Carl would question my role in his daughter's injury. Despite her agony, she'd hatched a plan to protect me from his wrath. I nodded and stamped up the stairs as loud as I could before dashing into my bedroom and closing the door. I leapt into bed just as Evie started yelling from the foot of the stairs. Today has been quiet with everyone at the hospital. At some point, I'll go into the basement and cover the chest with the picnic blanket and sweep some dust around to hide any footprints. I just don't feel like it yet. I'm quite happy rocking back and forth on my bed for now, thinking. What the fuck happened last night? That was only the beginning. The real horror is just around the corner. We heard a voice. Then my stepsister got stuck. Part 2. I dragged myself down to the cellar and tossed the blanket back over Carl's chest. Part of me wanted to open it, to stamp the jawbone to pieces for what it had done to Evie, but I was scared. Did I have the bravery to deal with it alone? If it was to be trusted, the bone had my stepdad begging on his knees for forgiveness every night. It made the big, stubborn man beg for God's sake. If it could do that to him, what could it do to a weakling like me? I gave the chest a petty little kick and trudged back up the stairs. A couple of weeks have passed now, and I'm really noticing Carl's trips to the basement. He mainly consults the bone before he goes to sleep, but not always. I opened the front door one morning to go to school and stepped out into the cold, my breath fogging. Turning to lock the door behind me, I saw the blurred shape of him through the frosted glass pane, emerging from below. Does he spend full nights down there? There's another problem, too. Someone else is going down to convene with the jawbone. In the small hours, I hear a slight scratching from Evie's bedroom. Then footsteps. Tiny creaks that disappear down the stairs ever so slowly. Evie's eyes are perpetually sunken and distant, her arm bound in a sling. She whispers to herself and avoids me. She's on a cocktail of painkillers, Matt. Best to leave her alone. My mom said when I raised the change in behavior one night. Mom, that's not the reason. You don't understand. Then Carl stepped over the threshold, returning from work. What have you been doing today? Using my water, my electricity, my heating, I suppose? Nothing, really, I replied sullenly. He swiped a finger over the wooden sideboard in the hallway and showed me the tip of his index finger, now gray with dust. Sorry, I said. If you were sorry, I wouldn't be walking into my house all dusty like this. Not good enough. I stood with lips pursed, my face an artificial mask of contemplation as he took off his shoes and strode past. The routine was hateful, but necessary. For some reason, Carl needed this saga to be played on repeat. To fight with him was to start World War III, and all the shouting, tears, and pleading that came with it. It'd be my mom who suffered the most if I took that course of action and forced her to side with one of us. She'd be torn apart by it. Knowing that he'd be monitoring the depth of my repentance for the dusty sideboard from the corner of his eye, I remained frozen while my mom fussed over Carl. Eventually, I slunk up to my bedroom and settled in for an early night, but sleep felt far away. I kept seeing and hearing the chest snap shut on Evie's arm. Her shock, her terror, her pain. I lied in bed reading, my eyes scanning whole paragraphs before I realized I hadn't taken in any information. All I could visualize was what had happened when me and Evie went down to the basement that night. Yesterday morning, I found my mom fussing over Evie at the dining table. "Are you sure your arm doesn't hurt, Evie, darling?" "No, honestly, it's okay." I raised an eyebrow and went to grab the cereal. I'd fractured my elbow at soccer practice last year and knew full well that it hurt in these early stages. Hurt like a bitch. The injury to Evie's arm was 10 times as bad as what had happened to me. "Well, if you need me to spoon feed you, that's no trouble." "Oh, I remember doing that for you when you were a baby, Matt, just like it was yesterday." "Sleep well, Evie?" I asked knowingly. She scowled, face still paler than it usually was, on and off. After breakfast, I saw Evie brushing her teeth with her broken arm in the bathroom. She bent over the sink to spit and started brushing with the other one. "Don't think I didn't see that," I said. "I already said it doesn't hurt." I considered her for a moment, standing there, obstinate. "What's the deal? I know you've been creeping down to the basement. What has that thing in your dad's chest asked for to heal your arm? Or is it a freebie? A generous gift? Out with it." Evie's eyes were glassy as she came close, skin so white it was almost translucent. "Why did you do this to me?" she asked. "Do what?" "Slam the lid on my arm. I know you did it." "Evie, no, I pulled you out of there. You fainted. You went to touch the jawbone and it slammed shut." "Lids don't slam shut on their own. Get out of my way." "Wait," I said before her bloodshot eyes widened and she bit down on my arm. I shrieked and Evie pushed past me, closing the bedroom door behind her. I examined the raw, red bite mark and pressed myself up against the door. "I've known you 10 years, Evie. We're family. That jawbone has known you for 2 weeks. Don't let it do to you what it's done to your dad. I'm going to talk with it," I said. Any faint-heartedness from the day before had vanished. My heart burned with a solid ferocity like iron at the core of the earth. That fucker in the chest was corrupting the relationship between me and my little stepsister. I marched into the basement while my mom was talking on the phone, flexing my hands into fists. No need to turn on the light this time as daylight seeped in from the small windows on ground level. I ripped the picnic blanket away and forced the lid up. The jawbone sat on its black cushion contentedly. "Boy, so that's the deal, huh? You turn Evie against me and in exchange, you heal her arm? What exactly is your game here?" "Bone knows bone. I merely repaired what was broken. Would you prefer to have the girl suffer? It was never that though, was it? Evie gets her arm fixed while you get your fix." She asked if it was true. "If her father was a murderer." "Do you know what I told her?" "Whatever you said, it was a lie." A pause. The jawbone looked pallid, pathetic almost, small and nesting, alone in the dark. The voice resumed. "I was a general from an old family who progressed beyond the age of battle. I toured military bases to give advice on strategy. At night, I liked to wander the grounds, to see bright lights shining down on flat buildings and parade grounds from afar, in the quiet, with the breeze. One night, I found myself strolling around the perimeter when I happened upon a small unit of men conducting a nighttime firing drill. The men lifted up their night vision goggles and saluted. I bade them continue. A soldier in the leftmost firing lane was struggling to hit anything, so I approached, but his aim only worsened. I put a hand on his shoulder in between shots, and against all protocol, he swiveled, pointing the barrel of his rifle at my midriff. A shot rang out, and I fell onto my back. The world was spinning, but I recognized the face above me as darkness closed in. A face you and the girl know well. A family as ancient and prestigious as mine cannot just be snuffed out, airless. So the one who was my ultimate undoing was called to the gravesite some years later, cursed to dig me up with bare hands and become my thrall. He only had the heart to linger long enough to grab the jawbone out of the coffin, the craven. At last, however, I could return to find a spiritual heir to my family. To find you. You can have that inheritance, boy. I see potential in you. The others can go to rot. Reach out and take it. Take it. I reached towards the jawbone. Dipping under the lid, I found the air to be stale and rank. A few rotten teeth were still lodged in the bone, brown yet sharp. Memories flashed into my mind's eye that weren't my own. A large house under a heavy night sky, an aristocratic woman lying crushed under a marble dining table, a room full of riches, chalices, ornate swords, antique rifles. It was dizzying, intoxicating. The tip of my finger drifted towards a molar. Matt, are you down there? I frowned, recoiled, banged my head on the upper lip of the chest and fell backwards onto my haunches, paralyzed with fear over what I was about to do. Yeah, I'm okay, Mom. Feet pounded down the basement stairs and I turned to see Carl standing there, cold fury in his eyes. My mom followed, confusion written across her face. Then Evie, higher still up the stairwell, and wary. Without ceremony, Carl strode over to me and drew back his fist. Dad, stop! Evie cried. Carl hesitated. The things that Bones says about you don't prove it right, she said. His fist dropped to his side. I'm not a murderer, Evie. Don't believe it, Carl said. His shoulders slumped and a pleading, whimpering tone entered his voice. I found this more disturbing than the raw anger it had replaced. A hollow laugh echoed out from the depths of the chest. Yes, you are. I didn't mean it, Carl snapped, half turning. That's not good enough. You disturbed me halfway through the drill. I was acquitted. Carl stepped toward the chest and I scrabbled to my feet, back against the wall. I'm just as dead. You craven, murderous thrall. Shame on you, beggar eternal. Bow to me. I hate you, Carl screamed before striding over to the chest and shattering the jawbone into pieces with the sole of his foot. The lid slammed shut on his kneecap once, twice, 3 times. It snapped open and closed piranha-like all the way along Carl's thigh, dragging him further into the chest. It twisted him around wickedly and bit down on his waist, which forced his free leg up above his shoulder, and still it chomped. Cries of pain and disbelief morphed into a long, primeval groan of utter agony. I rushed over to the chest, but it was too late. The chest now contained mangled pieces of the man who'd been my stepdad, sharp bones and blood and viscera. I closed the lid to save Evie and my mom from the sight. Tears will come later for all of us, I'm sure. The emergency services have taken the chest away for a proper examination and to conduct a post-mortem on the contents. But for now at least, none of us are under suspicion. It's hard to put my feelings into words. I'm sitting on my bedroom floor looking out of the window. Night is falling. The bone is gone. But at what cost? You might want to turn the lights on for this next one. It only gets darker from here. I met a monster at a craft store. I just needed some damn glitter. Money started to get a bit tight, so I started a side hustle. I made small things with resin like coffin-shaped trinket boxes and ashtrays. At first, they didn't sell. Then I started to add this super hollow round glitter to my pieces. I couldn't restock them fast enough, leaving the older pieces to collect dust. Due to using that type of glitter in everything, I ran out fast. A craft store near my place sold it and often had discounts. I decided to grind out filling the last few molds I could before heading to the store. One thing led to another, causing me to arrive there half an hour before closing. I walked into a nearly empty store. It was a big place with discounted Halloween decorations. I was distracted for a few minutes, looking to see if they had any cheap-themed glitter I could use. As far as I could tell, there was only one cashier somewhat hidden behind a wall of other discounted items. I didn't see any new glitter I liked among the seasonal items, so I went to get the one item I needed. 2 other customers were in the store. They passed by me, the older woman nodding in my direction. I returned the gesture to be polite. The girl with her was maybe still a teenager with straight black hair and dark eyes. Honestly, her stern face kind of put me on edge as her eyes followed my movements. She carried bundles of yarn for the older woman, so I assumed they were related. Walking down the aisle, I quickly found what I was looking for. It would only take me a moment to check out and then return home to start working on crafts again. The glitter was placed near the front of the store and at the checkout. I again stopped near the front corner to look over some displays they had on sale. I swear, this place always had sales going on. I planned on starting to get into making jewelry at some point. The shelves were full of necklace or bracelet displays. I picked one up considering I could use it for my new key rings for a craft show coming up. I felt something at my feet. A ball of yarn had rolled down the aisle and stopped near me. The younger girl with black hair silently walked over to retrieve it. I bent over, picked it up before her, and handed it over. She nodded without a smile on her stoic face. A loud bang and thud got our attention. We were a few steps away from a closed door labeled manager. I had heard voices in the office, but not what they were saying. The girl matched my expression. We both decided to investigate, my hand in my pocket, touching my phone in case of trouble. I reached for the door handle. At the same time, it flew open. A man stood breathing hard with a wild look in his eyes. The sudden size shocked me enough to freeze. I felt the other girl gripe the back of my shirt tightly. Then he reached out to drag us inside the office. He easily tossed us hard against the back wall of the room and slammed the door shut. My heart raced as my eyes took in the details of the room. There were a few monitors displaying parts of the store. I saw the girl's mother in one of the aisles, looking around for her now missing daughter. A desk took up most of the space. My eyes lowered to see another woman face down on the ground, fresh blood pooling around her head. She made me. She didn't fire me. I never would have needed to do this. The man started rambling, his hand pulling at his hair in a frantic manner. This was bad. Very bad. We had seen his crime, and now he wasn't certain what to do with us. I finally noticed a pistol holstered at his hip. One wrong move, and we would be dead. Everything happened so fast that it was hard to process. He grabbed my shoulders, dragging me to the desk. My back was slammed down against it, my heart in my throat. I prayed he would shoot me instead of doing anything else. He started to shake my body, the edge of the desk digging into my lower back. This is her fault. I was doing my job. I didn't do anything wrong. He shouted, face red and damp with sweat. Papers fell on the desk, scattering to the floor. A round glass paperweight started to roll towards us. I needed to take a chance or else I would die here. My hand shot out, grabbing hold of the smooth glass orb. With one swift motion, I slammed it against his temple. My attacker howled in pain, and his grip lessened. I slipped away, dizzy with fear. The other girl had opened the door to make a run for it. She was heading towards her mother, who had been walking towards the office door. I turned the other way, running towards the checkout, and in the direction of the exit. I turned my head to see if he was following us. The older man stumbled from the room, holding his bleeding head. His hand went to his side. Drawing his weapon, he raised it, firing wildly in front of him. To my horror, I watched the girl step in front of her mother, her head snapping back as a spray of blood exploded on the shelving next to her. The older woman wailed, collapsing to her knees, trying to catch the body of her fallen child. The scene made me stop. I hated myself for freezing. Thankfully, the gun was empty, so I wasn't going to be shot. Instead, the man charged over, grabbing a fistful of my hair to pull my head back. His arm started to wrap around my neck. On reflex, I grabbed it and then flipped him onto the ground. I thanked God I grew up with 3 roughhousing older brothers I didn't appreciate at the time. I knew a few throws, but I wasn't overly strong. I'd gotten one step away when he reached out to grab my ankle. I fell hard, my head hitting the tile floor. Within seconds, we were in a wrestling match. He was winning. I knew the cashier must have heard all of this. She would have called the cops by now. How long would it take them to arrive? Would I be dead by then? He landed a few blows to my face when I tried to raise my arms to defend myself. Blood started to pour out of my nose. His large hands then went to my neck, the thumbs painfully pushing down, immediately cutting off my breathing. There aren't any words to describe how terrifying being strangled is. This man outweighed me. He was so much stronger. I've never felt so hopeless before. No matter how much I clawed and struggled, he didn't stop his attack. I should have died. Turns out there was someone in the store that was stronger than him. His face grew pale, and a shocked expression came. His gripe lessened enough for me to get away. I crawled backward, gasping my entire body in pain. My eyes unfocused, but I saw a figure with long black hair stand up. A rush of confusing emotions exploded in my chest. I was glad she wasn't dead, but how? Her mother watched in horror as the child she loved steadily walked toward her would-be murderer. The main lights flickered, then went out, leaving only emergency lights. The man stood up, not understanding what was happening. He only knew he needed to run. His legs didn't take him very far. He collapsed in fear as he watched the girl's shape change. Countless dark hands like shadows appeared from the floor surrounding her. I pressed my back hard against the shelf behind me, praying this was all a nightmare. A set of hands caught him, large enough to cover most of his body. He was lifted into the air, sobbing and pleading to be spared. There was no emotion on her face. She simply glanced in my direction, cold eyes chilling me to the bone. Without a word, the shadow hands turned into a dark smoke that forced its way through his mouth and nostrils. His body tensed up, his eyes rolling back. Soon he started to jerk in unnatural and painful ways. Sounds like an animal being butchered came from him. His back arched, hands curled, tears streamed down his eyes. I didn't know what horrors he was experiencing and never wanted to know. It felt like hours he was tortured by those shadows. Finally, his body was dropped and the lights came back on. The hands disappeared, leaving the dark-haired girl calmly standing, almost admiring her handiwork. Then she turned around to go back to her mother. The older woman was still on the ground, cowering in fear. She let out a yelp when the girl got close, then reached out to throw the first thing she grabbed at her. "Mom," the girl said in a soft voice. "Get away from me. What are you? Why do you have my daughter's face? I knew you weren't right since the accident. Demon. Monster." The woman broke down in hysterics, her hand clutching a small cross around her neck. The girl didn't have much of a reaction. She took a few steps away, the stoic expression still on her face, but I thought there were a few hints of sadness. A pair of police officers came rushing in. One quickly went to me to help me off the ground. The other went to the mother, who was still screaming and sobbing. "What happened here?" one of them asked. I found myself unable to speak. How could I even explain all of this? That man shot a worker here. We saw it, and he tried to kill us. He had a heart attack. My mother isn't well. Seeing all of this made her relapse. The girl explained, doing her best to act a little upset over the entire situation. The pair didn't question her. They just got us all outside. The poor cashier came up to us, sobbing, wondering if we were all right. I thanked her for calling the police and hugged her until the cops wanted her statement. She could have left the store. Instead, she hunkered down behind her and stayed on the phone to make sure help arrived. Only one ambulance showed up. I let the mother take it. She needed to get away from this place. For a moment, I was left standing next to the girl, away from people who may be able to hear us talk. Her eyes stayed directed in front of her. I gathered enough courage to ask a question. "What are you?" I whispered. The bullet wound was gone, as well as any blood. She reached up to lift some of her hair to show off a scar on the side of her head. This girl was in an accident that made her brain dead. She wasn't using this body, so I took it. She explained, but that still didn't tell me much. Who knows how long she had been pretending to be human? Had she been waiting for the right chance to take over another body? Does she hurt humans? Maybe eat them? How many more of her kind were out there? Instead of asking any of that, I said something else. "Thank you," I told her. She could have pretended to be dead. I assumed she could sneak out of the body at the hospital and find a new host. Instead, she revealed herself and saved my life. "It was about time I left that woman behind anyway," she replied, arms behind her back, almost like in a military stance. "I'm sorry it had to be this way. If I wasn't here tonight, then maybe your mother would be grieving a daughter and not seeing you as a monster." She finally looked over at me, a warmer expression on her face. She took out something from her pocket and slipped it inside my jacket. Under the nose of two cops, she had smuggled a container of glitter I had not paid for. "That's shoplifting." I hissed, feeling weirdly stressed. We may be caught. I was stunned by her reaction. She smiled. Soon we were asked to give some statements. The rest of the night was a blur. After everything, my mother came to pick me up from the police station. I felt bad for making her go out of her way. She held back tears seeing the bruises. If I hadn't come across a monster that night, she would have lost a daughter. I didn't get contact information for that girl. I do wonder what happened to her. I hope that she and her mother can work to understand each other. Monster or not, she loved that woman. And that love may have played a role in saving my life. Because of that night, I decided to make a point of texting my parents how much I loved them every day from now on. Some of you should do the same because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. If you think you're safe now, you're wrong. The next story proves that the nightmare is far from over. That rectangular hole. This story is based on a real experience I had when I was a child, but dramatized for effect. I was 5, maybe 6, when this happened. We lived in this big old house, one of those 2-story types you see in small towns where the paint was fading and the wooden beams creaked under your footsteps. Our house was red on 3 sides, but for some reason, my dad never got around to painting the 4th. It was just left white, like he ran out of time, energy, or maybe he just stopped caring. The house had a certain creepy vibe to it, but structurally, it was in good shape. The front and back porches were solid, no sagging or rotting boards, just old wood that held on after years of weathering. But to me, the most important part of that house wasn't the solid porches or the old foundation. No, it was the door to my bedroom. Or more specifically, that rectangular hole in the top left corner of the door. The hole wasn't supposed to be there. One day, the wooden panel just vanished, leaving this perfect rectangle you could see through. Maybe it was a break in the old wood. Maybe it was the house itself, giving us another reason to think something was off. Either way, I hated it. That rectangular hole wasn't big, but it was enough to see through. And at night, when the hallway light was on, it cast this eerie glow that framed the hole perfectly. Every night, I'd lay in bed and try not to look at it, but I always did. The rest of the house? That was the setup to the nightmare that came after. You walked in the front door, and right in front of you were the stairs leading up to the 2nd floor. To the left was the living room, to the right was the dining room, and behind them, the kitchen. The bathroom was across from the living room, tucked into a dark little hallway. And upstairs? That's where my room was. My bed was shoved into the back left corner of the room. My brother's bed was against the wall, perpendicular to mine. His head was about 3 feet away from that dark brown door with that rectangular hole. We heard stories about the house being haunted. My parents would talk about seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothes down in the kitchen, or a man wandering the stairs in a dusty coat from the 1800s. I never saw them. I never wanted to. But I heard enough to know the house wasn't normal. One night, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. My brother was already out, breathing soft and slow, and the only light was from the hallway, spilling in through that damn rectangular hole in the door. I couldn't stop looking at it. It was like a window to another world, a world I didn't want any part of. Then, it happened. The first creak of the stairs. Now the first step of the stairs always made a noise. You know the one, old wood, groaning like it's about to give in. I thought at first it was my mom or dad, but after a few more creaky steps, I knew it wasn't them. These steps were slow, deliberate, heavy in a way that felt wrong. Step, creak, step, creak. I felt my heart pick up speed, pounding so hard I was sure it would wake my brother. But he didn't stir. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the footsteps kept coming, each one louder than the last, each one getting closer. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that rectangular hole. Step, creak, and then the steps stopped, right at the top of the stairs, right outside my room. I stared at the hole, praying that whoever, whatever, was out there would turn and go the other way. But I heard the footsteps again. They were coming toward my door. Closer, closer. My whole body was shaking, but my eyes stayed glued to that rectangular hole, my lifeline to the hallway beyond. I waited, every muscle in my body frozen with fear. Then slowly she appeared. A woman. Tall, thin. Her clothes were old, something out of a history book. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollowed out, her skin stretched tight like she hadn't eaten in years. I could only see the side of her head at first, but then she turned. She turned right toward that rectangular hole. Her face, oh God, her face. There were no eyes, just black, empty sockets staring straight through me. Her mouth hung open, but there were no lips, only a black void where her mouth should have been. I felt my heart stop. She stood there, inches from the hole, and then she began to lean toward it, slowly, menacingly, her hollow face coming closer and closer until it filled the entire rectangular space, staring right into my soul. And then she smiled, a twisted, hollow thing. "Go to sleep," she whispered, her voice low and rasping, like dead leaves scraping across the pavement. The way she said it, with those empty sockets fixed on me, it was like she wasn't giving me a choice. Like if I didn't go to sleep right then and there, something worse would happen. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I just lay there, frozen, staring through that rectangular hole at the woman with no eyes. Then she was gone, like she was never there at all. But the fear stayed. The cold sweat, the shaking. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I slept, I wouldn't wake up. Eventually, I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember, it was morning. The hallway light was off, and my brother was already up. But the fear, that stayed with me. And yeah, I'll admit it, I wet the bed. The fear that came from that nightmare? It was real enough to leave me shaking the next morning. It was just a nightmare. It had to be. That rectangular hole was still in the door, the same as it always was, and nothing seemed different. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. How real it had felt, how cold her voice had been when she said those words. Go to sleep. Just when you think it can't get worse, the next story comes to life. My dream home became a nightmare. I always wanted to live on a bit of land. Trees are beautiful, and being surrounded by them always made me calm. Now I understand how sinister they can be, what they can hide in their shadows. I was so excited about this new place, tucked in the woods a few miles out of a decently sized town. It was the Northwest U.S., so it was rainy a lot, but that suited me perfectly. I had just got my first successful novel off the ground, so most of my days were spent in my office. The rain on the window and the trees swaying just beyond the yard, always lulling me into a flow. It took far too long for me to notice how ominous the impenetrable foliage was. Sure, there were the occasional odd noises, animal calls that sounded unnatural, perhaps a bit too high-pitched, a bit too similar to human laughter, to human screams. I went out there a few times, just to make sure I didn't have any dangerous animals lurking about the property. I found some strange things. Tracks that looked more like gouges than prints, eviscerated animal carcasses. Looking back, I should have realized that far too much meat had been left behind. That too many bones had been splintered. I am by no means a tracker. I enjoy camping and hiking, but I really didn't know what I was looking for in those woods. I assumed it was a mountain lion. I knew they made some distressing sounds and chalked up the dead animals to its prey. We didn't have any pets, and our kids were just old enough to understand how dangerous walking in the woods was with a wild animal on the loose. They never seemed to like going in there anyway. I suppose I'm grateful for that, but I wish I had recognized their hesitation as the sign that it was. Hell, even I avoided the place. It was beautiful, sure, but so quiet, aside from the occasional concerning yelps that emanated from within. Still, it never seemed like a truly sinister place to me. Of course, so much untamed forest would be home to some wild animals. That was almost part of the appeal for me. I had grown up in Texas, so I already had a few guns locked up in a safe, and sometimes, after I heard a shriek that sounded a bit too close to the house, I took one out and went for a look around. I never came across a thing, so I made a mental note to talk to Warden. It's a shame I never got around to it. Maybe things would have been different. Eventually, the off-putting nature of the forest just blended into the backdrop. The kids still played in the yard. I still stared blankly at the woods from my office window. Everything seemed completely fine, just as long as we kept our distance. It took one night for my perception to change. The wife and I left our kids with a sitter for a date in town. We made sure the house was stocked with everything they would need, so nobody would need to leave the property. What a blissful evening. The last one, before the constant dread. When we pulled back up to our house, I caught a glimpse of it, the gaunt, animalistic figure in the tree line. I didn't get a good look at first, but what stuck out was its pallid flesh and its small, round head. Almost like a human's, it recoiled from my headlights and disappeared into the trees. My wife inhaled sharply and grabbed my arm. It had only been visible for a few seconds, but that was enough. Enough to let us know that it was no ordinary animal. I pulled into the garage and got out of the car. Before I shut the garage door and went inside, I stepped out onto the driveway. I wanted to see if the creature was still hanging about. I gazed intently at where it had loped back into the trees, but I couldn't make out anything. I did hear rustling, though, like something heavy was prowling just beyond my vision. Then there was a piercing cackle, much closer than I had ever heard before. I immediately turned and ran back into the garage, hitting the automatic closer button as I did. I then stood in the doorway of my home and watched as the agonizingly slow garage door rolled its way down. A few feet before it touched the ground, I saw 4 limbs appear in the shrinking crack. The front 2 seemed thick and splayed far out in front of whatever they were attached to, while the back 2 were smaller and folded back on themselves, giving a disproportionate look that did not seem like something found in nature. Once the paneled door shut fully, I hesitated for a moment. After a brief silence, I heard a resonant tap on the garage door and saw it shake as if struck. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. I found the sitter on the couch, staring at me with thinly veiled concern. "Are you all right?" she asked. My face must have been somewhat alarming. I don't think I was hiding my anxiety well. "Where is my wife?" I inquired in return. "She went to check on the kids. I promise I got them into bed at a reasonable time." I nodded and tried to calm down. I put on what must have been an unconvincing smile and asked, "Did you hear anything strange while we were gone?" I remember the deepening of her concerned expression when I asked this question. She was only able to give a small nod before our conversation was cut off by a shriek coming from the front yard. I froze, staring into the sitter's eyes. The look on her face had evolved into blatant fear. Within moments, my wife appeared from a hallway that led deeper into the house, our 1-year-old son still sleeping in her arms. Our 3-year-old daughter was trailing behind her, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "What was that sound, Daddy?" she asked me, childlike fear present in her voice. "Nothing, honey," I tried to assure her, but my words of placation were undercut by a slamming at our front door. The sound the creature emitted when it hit the sturdy oak was far lower and more guttural in nature than its previous shrieks. My daughter screamed, and without hesitation, I scooped her up and charged down the hallway. We came to our storage room, and I ushered my family and the sitter inside. It was in the center of the house, with no windows, canned food, bottled water, and most importantly, my gun safe. I switched on the light and fumbled with the safe code. Once I got it open, I loaded a 12-gauge shotgun with a few shells and stared at the door. My daughter started to cry, and I calmed her with quiet words and her favorite lullabies. Once she had subsided into whimpers, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher had barely answered before I frantically explained the situation. "Clam down, sir. Where are you? We need your location." I remember the silence that followed after I recited my address. The single shaky breath the dispatcher took before ending the call with a click. I tried to call back multiple times, but none went through. My best hope at that point was to believe that officers were on their way. I now know that I had moved to a cursed place. That local law enforcement knew to stay away. Bastards could have let me in on it before I brought my family there. We waited in that storage room for hours. Eventually, the sitter's mother called her, chastising her for staying out so late. She was a high school student, the daughter of my wife's friend. She cried when she tried to explain her situation, but I suppose her mom wasn't privy to the same knowledge as the police, and merely got angrier at her daughter's ridiculous excuse to stay out late. She threatened to come pick her up and give us a lecture about her daughter's time, which our poor sitter pleaded against. Unfortunately, this only seemed to reinforce the stubborn mother's belief that her teenage daughter was breaking the rules, and ended the call saying she was coming to pick her up. Our sitter tried to call back a few times, sent a dozen text messages, then just held her head and cried as more muffled shrieks and growls began to reach our ears. It wasn't long until a very drawn-out, very human scream accompanied them. "Mom!" the sitter shouted, jumping to her feet. She ran to the door and grabbed the knob with a shaking hand. She waited, fear wrought into her frame. I stood behind her, torn on what to do. Then a second scream, more gurgled and desperate than the last, sent the sitter flying out of the room. I followed after her, shotgun at the ready. "Lock this door and don't open it again until you hear my voice," I called to my wife, who barely had time to protest before I was out the door. Once we reached the living room, the screams had become louder and were mixed in with the sounds of tearing flesh. The sitter was standing by the front door, which was thankfully still in place, listening with a horrified expression. It sounded as if her mother was being torn apart mere feet away from where we were. The sitter gripped the door handle, unable to bring herself to open it. I quietly pulled her away and peeked out of an adjacent window. The creature was brutalizing what was now a human corpse. In the short time since the first scream, the sitter's mom had been reduced to a mangled, bloody mess. The horrible monstrosity didn't even seem to be consuming the meat, just throwing it around in some sort of perverse revelry. I watched it tear the limbs off the woman, and wave them around with vigor, slamming them into the pavement until they were nothing but bloody stumps. I saw it smash her head like an overripe melon with one stomp of its massive forelimb. The look on its face, I will never forget. It was much too close to human, except the features were distorted. Two big eyes that were almost all pupil. A too wide mouth, grinning with jagged teeth at the horrific scene it was creating. No nose or ears, only slits in its pale, hairless head. Its entire body was hairless. Only tight flesh stretched over prominent bones. It looked like a skeleton covered in fetid canvas. Its limbs were too long and angled backwards, as if in perverse mockery of all things natural. I retched and stumbled away. The thought of opening the door and firing at it did not even enter my mind. At that moment, only primal fear and revulsion consumed me. I turned to the sitter and shook my head, fighting the urge to vomit. I gestured to her to return to the storage room, but she merely stared back with tears in her eyes. So lost were we in our distress that we did not immediately notice that silence replaced the wet crunching that had filled the air moments before. It wasn't until a delicate scraping began on the scrubbed oak of the front door that we snapped back to our senses. We were both frozen in fear. I was unable to run back to my family, despite my desperate desire to. The slow sound rooted me to the spot, and I wasn't freed until the scraping stopped and was followed by a crash on the roof. The creature moved quickly then, skittering across the shingles to the large windows of my study upstairs. It was so fast that neither the sitter nor I could react until we heard shattering glass, followed by heavy footfalls quickly making their way to the stairs. It was in the house. "Go," I screamed before pelting toward the storeroom. I wish I could say that I dragged the sitter along, that I covered her while she ran ahead, but I cowardly ran to the only place that held any semblance of sanctuary. When I reached the door, I looked back to see the sitter a ways behind me. The poor girl must not have started running as quickly as I had. She gave me a terrified look as the creature swiped her legs out from under her, sending her to the floor. I got a full view as the creature, face lit up with glee, grabbed the top of the sitter's cranium with a disfigured hand and pulled backward, ripping off the top of the girl's head, leaving only her lower jaw behind. The image of her tongue lolling out of the gaping maw, the blood spurting out and painting the walls, is one I will never forget. But I am even more haunted by the sound that her body continued to make. It was only about a second, but a gurgled scream still emanated from the halfway decapitated body's throat. I still vividly remember the creature lifting its gaze to me, boring its black eyes into my soul, and raising the top part of the sitter's head to stare at me as well. Her eyes were still flitting around in their sockets as blood poured from her torn flesh. I screamed in terror. The monstrosity cackled. The sitter's eyes glazed and went still. There was a moment of sickening silence. Then my wonderful brave wife yanked the door open and pulled me inside the storage room. She locked it behind me, and I collapsed to the ground. Call me a coward, but all I could do was cradle the shotgun that I should have fired at the beast. Truly, every other thought was driven from my mind when I fell into its cold, black eyes. It wasn't until I saw the terrified face of my daughter that I began to regain composure. My family was in here, the one thing I truly valued above myself. I shakily stood and aimed the gun directly at the door. It wasn't the thick oak of the front entrance, and after witnessing what the creature could do, I had no doubt it could smash through it with ease. Yet, it never did. It snarled and cackled and made grotesque sounds right outside the door. It scratched at the wood separating us. It cracked the sitter's bones and tore her flesh aggressively, but never truly attempted to enter the storeroom. After a few of the longest hours of my life, I heard the heavy footfalls of its retreat. My son had woken up for a portion of the horrible noises, and he joined the rest of us in our silent crying. We stayed in that room for a few days, eating the canned rations and drinking bottled water until the smell of rotting flesh became unbearable. I had tried a few more times to get in contact with the authorities, but I was consistently met with fear and inaction. When we finally emerged from the storeroom, my family was met with a nightmare scene. What was once our babysitter was smeared onto every surface of the hallway. Teeth clung to chunks of pallet stuck to the ceiling. Bone fragments littered the hallway amidst shredded organs, along with what seemed like gallons of congealed blood. Unidentifiable mounds of meat were smashed into the carpet, walls, ceiling, and every crevice between the storage room and the living room. Both of my children were violently ill. So was my wife. I was in a state of complete shock. I numbly ushered my family through the horrid hallway, out the front door, past the rotten pile of meat that was once the sitter's mother, and into our car. The entire time I had a white-knuckled grip on the shotgun. I started the car and drove to the edge of our property. Just before I got to the end of our long driveway, the horrible creature emerged from the dark forest that encroached from either side of us. It stood in its distorted, stooped manner, blocking me from the road that would lead us into town. It stared with a delighted malice, and I knew in that moment that it reveled in our fear. It terrorized us for pure pleasure. My children started to cry. My wife whimpered. I went numb and prepared for the worst. But after a final, bone-chilling cackle, it moved along. I never returned to that house. Everything I ever owned was there, but it isn't worth it. I didn't put it up for sale. I would never run the risk of putting another person there. Maybe when the bank forecloses it and sells all my belongings, some poor fool will snatch it up. I went in person to the local police station and told them what happened. They stared solemnly at me and simply nodded. I was not given a witness report to fill out. Only the advice, leave and never return. I followed that advice. I don't know what to make of any of this, but I have learned something. Never live in a forest. You think you've seen it all? The real terror is about to unfold in our next tale. I joined a run club after a string of disappearances in my neighborhood. What I found was terrifying. I decided, on a whim, to join my local run club. A flyer on a lamppost in my neighborhood gave me the idea. A ragged thing nestled among the missing person posters, boasting that all paces were welcome, even absolute beginners. An optional gathering at a bar afterwards. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd normally be interested in. You see, I've been running for 2 decades now, placed among the first at a handful of smaller races. I'm fast, very fast, and that sort of training is usually a solitary endeavor. I arrived early, where a handful of people were gathered in a small plaza by the river. The run club's members chatted amongst themselves, old friends. I tried to look for any other person who was standing awkwardly to the side like I was, but there were none, even as more people arrived. I stuck out like a sore thumb, dressed in performance leggings and reflective gear, while everyone else practically wore flat-soled sneakers. I received glances from some of them, looking me up and down, hungrily devouring my embarrassment. Eventually, a man took pity on me. He was dressed just like I was, another person who actually took the lifestyle seriously. And honestly, he didn't look half bad. That's hard to pull off in a day-glow orange compression tank top. He introduced himself as James, the leader and organizer of the club. We chatted for a few minutes about races we've competed in, our pace time, and which shoes we favored. He told me he started the club after the random disappearances began happening in the area around last year. Turns out people feel a lot safer running in a group rather than alone on the street. He'd gotten to make a lot of friends and explored the neighborhood. And, he leaned in with a wink, he had gotten to meet some very interesting people. He turned around, just in time to miss me blush, to announce the warm-up stretches to the group. I was already planning our first date in my head as we worked through knee raises and quad extensions. And then it was time to run. We had gone over the route briefly, but I missed most of it. I had better things to think about anyway, like Dayglow James. I figured I'd just follow the crowd. That turned out to be quite difficult. After the first 2 blocks of running, I realized I was a block ahead of everyone else, even James. Hard to follow those who were behind you. I doubled back and slowed to a crawl to keep pace with the group. Runs taken at a slower pace were also important for training, I reminded myself. Plus, I'd be able to keep my breath steady enough to have a conversation with James. He had announced he would be staying towards the back of the group to make sure no one got left behind. At first, we took a route I was familiar with, a few minutes along the waterfront before turning in to run in the neighborhood. We passed a deli, the post office, a convenience store. We made a left down an unfamiliar street, one I hadn't seen before, despite living in the neighborhood for over 5 years. There was a dilapidated church on each corner, towering and decrepit and covered in vines, and the sidewalks had seen better days. "I don't think I've been this way before," I said to James. He nodded. "Not surprising," he said between breaths. "It's not exactly pretty here. I run this way because the streets are totally empty. Don't want to crowd a busy sidewalk." He was beautiful, his dark hair catching the subsiding light in just the right way. As we passed between the churches, I imagined my own church wedding with him. We were now passing warehouse after abandoned warehouse. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows. I was beginning to see my exhalation in the air, and I zipped up my vest preemptively, bracing for the cold. No one was chatting anymore but James and I, all of them too out of breath. All that was audible was the thump of our shoes hitting the pavement. No cars, no other pedestrians. Our numbers sounded light. I looked around at the group. "James," I said, "I think we lost a few people." "Yeah, probably. Sometimes the newcomers give up partway through the run and turn back. Sometimes their pace is just too slow and they have to find the way on their own. You know how it is." "Oh," I said, "I thought you stayed at the back of the group so everyone could keep up." He smiled. "You know how it is," he said again. Down the block, 2 large buildings on either side of the street grew larger as we approached them. The 2 old churches. But it was impossible. We hadn't once turned since we started running in the industrial area. There was no way we could have been approaching them from the same way we initially had. Perhaps I was distracted. I accepted it and kept moving past the graffitied warehouses. "I live around here, you know," said James. "Yeah? In a warehouse?" "You could call it converted. You could call it illegal," he said, smiling. "Sounds like I couldn't call it cozy," I replied. He laughed. "No, you certainly couldn't. You know what the worst part of it is? It's really annoying to get food. No delivery options? Not any that suit our dietary restrictions. You train too. You must understand my pain." I smiled. "I know how it is." We fell silent and kept running. I looked around and realized there were fewer people still, bringing us to around 15 total. "Maybe we should slow down? People seem to have trouble keeping up," I said. He shook his head. I understood. We could not possibly be going any slower. I felt a fondness for him. He was doing a service to the community by providing a safe space to run. If people couldn't actually run, that wasn't his fault. And yet, slowly, we approached something looming in the distance. The 2 churches. Again, come to think of it, we had been going for at least 2 miles. If we really had been running in a straight line, we should by now have hit the highway underpass, about a mile inland from the river we came from, and yet it was nowhere in sight either, not even in the distance. "We passed these before," I said as we ran between the crumbling churches. "A lot of them in the area, I guess," he said. But something in the way he spoke gave me pause. His tone was no longer conversational. In fact, it sounded defensive, as if he knew exactly what I was talking about. I was in danger. The sun was nearly beneath the horizon behind us, the temperature dropping by the minute. For the first time I looked closely at the other runners. I expected to find them out of breath, possibly even confused like I was. Instead, they ran urgently, intently. The effort they appeared to exert did not match the speed they ran. It looked like they were almost running in place, slow motion only in pace, as if they were charging through deep mud. And every single one of them was crying. They looked far, far in the distance ahead of them with expressions of absolute terror on their faces, tears streaming down their cheeks. I tried to see what they were looking at, but there was nothing but warehouses. No underpass, no pedestrians, no cars, nothing. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, but the whites of their eyes looked darkened, giving the appearance that they were completely black. "What's going on?" I asked. "Keep going," whispered another runner. He smiled. "Keep going," he said too, "and stay with the group." "You'll be safe with the group," said another runner. I looked behind us. The sun had set, but the river we had come from was nowhere to be seen. Just miles of warehouses fading into the darkness. The few street lamps lining the sidewalk had flickered on, dousing us in a sodium orange glow. And there were even fewer runners than before still. I could count the lot of us on my hands. 8 people creeping forward like encroaching sludge, yet running as if they were in a 100-meter sprint. I kept running at my slow pace, despite the alarm bells going off in my head. I just had to make it to the corner. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. I still stuck with the group until the last possible second. Then I hit a hard right and tried to turn down another desolate and unfamiliar street. Something caught my arm. One of the runners, holding me firmly by the elbow, dragging me ahead as she sprinted straight ahead at a snail's pace. "You don't want to do that," she said. "Folks who turn off tend to lose their way." I kept running forward, again between the 2 churches, again past the warehouses, again over the broken sidewalks. I was also beginning to tear up, afraid and confused and wanting to go home. My smartwatch told me we had been running for over an hour, but had not logged any distance. I cursed myself for leaving my phone at home. Just 2 blocks later, the ivy-coated churches again. "They're getting closer together," said James in a happy sing-song. "We're almost at the end." Our group was now just 5 runners, including James and I. "Where?" I managed to gasp. I couldn't finish my sentence. "Maybe they got tired," said James lightly. At that, the fear cocooned my ribcage, and I felt a few tears fall down my cheek. I took a look over my shoulder, past the preternaturally slow runners, at the line of garages and warehouses behind us. The dark of night was encroaching, limiting the field of distance. Just at the boundary of my vision, something moved and writhed in the darkness, in complete silence. It kept pace with us, ever so slowly, staying at the edge of where I could no longer see into the night. I could barely make out an outline. "Don't look back," said James. "We're so close." I would keep pace with the group. I would keep going straight, but there was no way I wasn't looking back. That thing in the shadows, whatever it was, sent a bolt of electricity up my spine. I had to know what was back there. Brief gleams from the sodium bulbs of the streetlights illuminated small portions of the thing as it passed them. It looked metallic, or wet, or highly reflective. Standing about 7 feet tall and nearly as wide, it moved forward with a tangled mass of twitching, vine-like limbs. They swept out, reaching towards us, becoming momentarily visible in the light. It, too, looked like it should have been moving faster than it was. Tendrils reached out, stomped forward, but propelled it just inches at a time. To the side, the runner that had prevented me from turning slowed to a stop and leaned forward out of breath. As we ran further from her, the thing in the shadow grew closer. I could barely see, but when it reached her, the vines seemed to wrap around her, encasing and swallowing her. I screamed. It was just James and I then. "Keep going," he said. "Stay with me. You'll be okay." This whole time I had believed I'd be safe with others, not turning, slowing myself down to the speed of the crowd to the point of aggravation and insanity. And now I was running alone with a stranger in the middle of nowhere while being chased by something not of this world. "Is it yours?" I asked him. He nodded. "I'm sorry," he said. "You do seem lovely." I acted against my better judgment by coming to the club in the first place, and I was doing it again now by listening to James, running at a crawl. I looked back once more at what was behind me. It was drawing closer now, no doubt about it. Yet it was still barely visible, the darkness creeping closer and concealing it. Soon we'd be encased in shadow and it would reach me. I couldn't afford to keep going so slowly, so I sped up. I began to outpace James with ease, running further from the darkness behind us both. I felt him swipe for my arm, trying to pull me back. He missed. James called out after me, "Don't leave me. Please. It'll—" He trailed off. For the first time he sounded afraid. "Go faster," I called back to him. "I can't." One last glance back as I sprinted forward at only twice his speed. His expression was unreadable, devastated and afraid and angry and something else. "I'm starving," I heard him say. The darkness overtook him, and just before I turned back around, I could swear I saw tendrils slithering and constricting around him. I ran forward, faster than ever, a push even for myself. The darkness fell further and further away as I continued down the block of warehouses. On the next corner were the churches again, growing closer and closer as I sprinted toward them. As soon as I passed between them, something shifted in the air. I was no longer surrounded by warehouses, but the blocks of my neighborhood I was familiar with. I was all alone on the abandoned residential street. I looked back, expecting to find darkness and warehouses, but I could see the river plaza we started from only a few short blocks away. My watch read 3 a.m., goosebumps still raised all over my skin. I ran home as fast as I could and called the police as soon as I was reunited with my phone. Of course, I sounded exactly the way a sweaty, exhausted lady at 3 a.m. would. I was quickly dismissed. Perhaps they would have taken me more seriously if I told them what I saw on my way home. On a lamppost, a ragged thing nestled among the Run Club posters, was a missing person poster with James's face. He's been gone for over 4 months and was the last one to go missing. Running should be a solitary pleasure. I know that now, but it's been months since this happened, and something is drawing me back. Maybe it's the increasing number of disappearances in our small city, or maybe it's the fact that an equal number of new Run Club posters have been going up. I'm terrified, but I know I need to get to the bottom of what I saw. Maybe I'll go back to Run Club. That last story was just a warm-up. What's coming next will make you question everything. I work the night shift at a pawn shop. Something here is watching me. Working the night shift at a pawn shop wasn't exactly my dream job, but the pay's decent, and with bills piling up, I don't really have the luxury of quitting. The shop itself wasn't anything special, just a cluttered place full of forgotten items. Old radios, tarnished jewelry, dusty tools. Still, something about it always felt a little off after dark. It was probably just my imagination, or the fact that the shop was located in a sketchy part of town. I tried not to think too much about it. Tonight had been uneventful so far. The usual late-night stragglers had wandered in, mostly people trying to sell off old electronics, a few desperate folks pawning jewelry for some quick cash. By 2 a.m., the shop was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. I hadn't gotten much rest before the shift, so I figured watching some YouTube videos might help keep me distracted. I was struggling to keep my eyes open when, all of a sudden, a man walked in. The man looked nervous from the moment he stepped through the door. He was tall, with bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, and his hands fidgeted as he clutched a small, wooden box under one arm. I hadn't seen him before, and I'd been working here long enough to recognize most of the late-night customers. I glanced up from the counter. "Can I help you?" I asked. He stepped forward, not saying much, just placed the box down carefully. It was a nice piece, I'll admit, made of old wood, really detailed carvings. Probably one of those things you'd see in an antique store. I half expected him to give me some long story about where it came from or how valuable it was, like most people did when they wanted to pawn off something that looked remotely fancy. "I need to get rid of this," he said, his voice quiet, a little shaky. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back a bit. "Get rid of it? Not sell it?" He shook his head quickly. "I don't care what you give me for it. I just don't want it anymore." I couldn't help but chuckle under my breath. "That bad, huh? What, does it play annoying music or something?" He didn't laugh, just stood there, tense. "No, it's weird." I glanced at the box, not feeling anything off about it, just wood, carved all fancy. "Weird how?" The man rubbed the back of his neck, clearly struggling to put his thoughts into words. I don't know. Strange things have been happening. At first, it was small stuff. I'd put it on a shelf and the next morning it would be in a different spot. Thought I was just imagining it, you know? But then it got worse. I started hearing noises, scratching sounds, and at night, I'd smell this awful metallic stench. I've cleaned my place top to bottom, but it's like the smell is coming from the box. His eyes met mine, wide and haunted. I don't know what's in it, and I don't want to know. I just need it gone. People usually came in hoping to score a few extra bucks, especially with something that looked old and possibly valuable, but this guy just wanted it gone. Okay, I said slowly, trying to hide my skepticism. I'll take it off your hands. Before I could reach for the box, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly cold. Don't open it, he said sharply. Whatever you do, don't open it. I raised my eyebrows, more amused than alarmed. Sure, no problem. He let go of my wrist and stepped back, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Good. I don't care how much you give me for it. Just keep it. He took the money I gave him, and without another word, he turned and hurried out the door, the bell jingling softly as he disappeared into the night. I shook my head and looked down at the box, still sitting on the counter. He'd seemed pretty worked up over it, but to me, it just looked like an old trinket box, nothing special. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. The carvings were detailed, swirling patterns running along the surface. It had some weight to it, more than I expected for something so small. But other than that, it was just a box. No scratching, no creepy smells, just wood. I tucked it into a drawer under the counter, out of sight, and got back to work. There wasn't much to do this late, just the usual inventory check and making sure the display cases were clean. But even as I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, my mind kept drifting back to that guy and the way he'd looked at the box. Still, I shrugged it off. People bring all kinds of weird stories in here, hoping their stuff's got some mystery value. This was probably just another one of those. I wiped down the counter, thinking about how nice it would be to close up and head home. The hours ticked by, and the shop was as quiet as ever. That's when I noticed it, a faint, almost metallic smell hanging in the air. I wrinkled my nose, trying to place where it was coming from. Maybe something in the back had gone bad. I checked the shelves, the back room, and even the trash, but everything seemed normal. Weird. When my shift finally ended, I was more than ready to leave. Locking up, I stepped out into the cool night air and tried to shake off the unease that had been creeping in all night. The walk home was quiet, the city mostly asleep, and by the time I got back to my apartment, I'd nearly forgotten about the box. My apartment was small and cluttered, but it was mine. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Home was safe, normal. I put the strange events of the night behind me and fell into bed, exhausted. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what was inside that box and why the man had been so terrified of it. Back at the shop the next night, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, but the minute I did, something felt different. As I walked the aisles, it seemed like some of the items had moved. Little things, like the keys hanging on the wall, were now slightly askew, and the doll I hated, the one in the far corner, was now facing me, even though I was sure I'd turned it away yesterday. I stared at it for a second, convinced I must have just misremembered. Still, a shiver crawled down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, but then, while I was restocking the glass case, I heard something. A faint sound, like scratching, coming from the drawer under the counter. I froze, my hands hovering over the case. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. Something was moving. Slowly, I stepped toward the counter, heart pounding in my chest. I pulled open the drawer, and nothing. The box, sitting just as I'd left it. Nothing unusual, no sign of movement. I went back to my routine, forcing myself to focus on different things. And every now and then, I'd catch the faintest whisper of sound coming from the direction where the doll was. By the time I locked up and left, my nerves were shot. As I made my way home, I kept my head down, the cool night air biting at my skin. I felt on edge, unable to shake the creeping sensation that I was being followed, that something unseen was watching my every move. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt exhausted, both physically and mentally, but the unease from the shop still clung to me. I locked the door behind me and went straight to bed, hoping that sleep would drown out the creeping dread. But as I lay there in the dark, something felt wrong. My apartment was too quiet, too still. I turned over, closing my eyes, willing myself to sleep. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the TV turning on in the living room. I sat up, my heart pounding. The room was still dark, but the faint flicker of light from the TV cast shadows across the hallway. I hadn't turned it on. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the low static humming from the other room. Finally, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the living room, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I rounded the corner, I saw the TV screen flickering, bathing the room in a pale, ghostly light. Static buzzed across the screen, but as I stood there, staring at it, I noticed something else. I heard a low groan, like furniture being dragged across the floor, coming from the bedroom. My blood froze, and I felt paralyzed with fear. I had been there just a moment ago. I rushed to the bedroom and switched the lights on. There wasn't anybody there, but what I noticed made my skin crawl. The wardrobe had been dragged, leaving deep scratches in the floor, and its doors were slightly ajar, as if someone or something had just stepped out. Then, without warning, the static on the TV shifted. The screen flickered and switched to a news channel, the volume creeping up on its own. A woman's voice echoed through the room, but what she was saying froze the blood in my veins. White Caucasian male was found dead late last night after an apparent suicide. Police say the man, whose identity has not yet been released, jumped from the roof of a downtown building. A photo of the man appeared on the screen, the man from the pawn shop. His gaunt, haunted eyes stared back at me, a face I hadn't been able to forget since he handed me that box. He was dead. The same man who'd practically begged me to take the box, who had warned me not to open it. The camera panned to the building where he'd died, the anchor's voice continuing, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with dread. I sank onto the couch, trying to steady my breathing, but the whispers I had heard earlier were growing louder, circling me. I looked around the room, certain I was alone, but unable to shake the feeling that something else was there. The man's death, the box, the strange occurrences in the shop and my apartment, it was all connected. I couldn't stop thinking about the news. The man dead. Thrown himself off a building, just like that. His face on the TV kept flashing in my mind. Those haunted eyes that had stared at me across the counter at the pawn shop. The box was still at the shop. I hadn't touched it since he left it there, but I could feel its pull. Something inside it wanted out, and the man had known that. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer, so I got dressed and left the apartment. I wandered into a nearby cafe to grab a coffee, desperate to shake off the exhaustion that had been creeping over me after everything that had happened. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I was startled awake by one of the baristas, who told me I'd been out for almost an hour, and they were worried something was wrong. Feeling a sudden, uneasy surge of energy, I tried to keep myself distracted for the remainder of the day. Walking aimlessly through the park, hopping from one cafe to another, but the exhaustion weighed on me, and I found myself nodding off here and there, barely holding on to any sense of sanity, trying to brace myself for the next night shift. I couldn't stay like this. I knew something had to be done. That evening, I walked into the pawn shop with dread twisting in my stomach. Everything felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. The lights flickered in a way they hadn't before, longer, darker, like something was hiding just beyond their glow. The air felt suffocating, thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every sound, from the creak of the old floorboards to the hum of the ancient fridge in the back, was amplified, making me jump at the smallest noise. I moved toward the back of the shop, where the shelves were lined with old toys, clocks, and other knickknacks. That's when I saw it, the doll. The same one I had hated since the first day I laid eyes on it. It was always there, sitting on the shelf, staring straight ahead with those dead, glassy eyes. But now it wasn't sitting. It was standing. At first I thought I was seeing things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. but it was real. The doll stood there, its vacant eyes now locked on mine, as if it was watching my every move. It didn't shift, it didn't move. But something about it was horribly, unnervingly wrong. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the doll, my breath caught in my throat. It stayed there, unmoving, its eerie gaze fixed on me, as if daring me to make the first move. My heart pounded harder with each step as I edged toward the front of the shop, my body trembling. Finally, I reached the counter, my back hitting the hard surface. My hands fumbled for the drawer, yanking it open with a sharp pull. My fingers curled around the box inside. I didn't care about the man's warnings anymore. I didn't care what was inside. All I knew was that I needed to get rid of it. Without thinking, I stuffed the box into my bag and ran out of the shop, into the night. The air outside was cold, biting at my skin as I rushed down the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the old river on the edge of town. The water was dark, reflecting nothing but the night sky. I stood at the bank, panting, my breath forming clouds in the air as I stared at the box in my hands. I threw the box as hard as I could, watching as it arced through the air and splashed into the river. For a moment, the water rippled, the box bobbing at the surface before it sank, disappearing into the depths. I stood there, my breath finally slowing. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was gone. I'd done it, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A shadow moved at the edge of the water, barely visible in the darkness. I froze, squinting into the night, but I couldn't see anything. Just shadows, just the trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head and walked back to the pawn shop, telling myself it was over. When I arrived back at the shop, I told myself I'd forget all about it. The box was gone. Everything was normal again. I had to believe that. But the moment I walked through the door, my stomach dropped. The drawer was open, and the box was inside, dripping wet. I stared at it, my heart pounding. How? I had thrown it in the river. I had seen it sink. There was no way it could be back. But there it was, sitting in the drawer like it had never left. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around me like a storm. I felt panic clawing at my throat. There was no escaping it. The box wanted something, and until I figured out how to stop it, it would never leave me alone. Desperation clung to me like a second skin as I left the shop, clutching the cursed box under my arm. The weight of it felt heavier than before, as though it had soaked up all the fear and dread I had been feeling since the man first left it with me. My mind raced, searching for any solution, any way to rid myself of the box once and for all. The river hadn't worked. It had returned to me, wet and dripping, as if mocking my attempt. I needed something else. I needed to destroy it completely. An old, abandoned warehouse nearby was the only place I could think of. Forgotten and crumbling, with no one around to question why I was setting something on fire in the dead of night. When I arrived, the warehouse loomed before me like a hulking corpse. Its roof had collapsed long ago, leaving its skeleton exposed to the elements. The place smelled of decay and rot, but it was quiet, isolated. I found some old, broken wooden furniture and piled it in the center of the open space. The moonlight trickled in through gaps in the roof, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked concrete floor. With trembling fingers, I placed the box on top of the makeshift pyre. It sat there, small and innocent-looking, as though it hadn't caused all this chaos. But I knew better now. I fumbled with the matches, striking them over and over until finally a small flame sparked to life. I set the fire carefully, watching as the flames licked at the dry wood, the heat growing stronger with each passing second. The fire spread quickly, consuming the furniture, and I stepped back, holding my breath as the flames began to crawl toward the box. For a moment, the box sat untouched, as though the fire refused to touch it. The flames danced around it, flickering and twisting unnaturally, casting grotesque shapes across the warehouse walls. Then, slowly, the edges of the box began to darken and curl. But just as the fire caught, something changed. The flames shifted, turning an eerie shade of blue, then green, colors no fire should ever burn. The air around me grew thick, almost oppressive, like the weight of the entire warehouse was pressing down on me. And then came the screams. They started softly, like distant wails carried on the wind, but quickly grew louder, agonizing, high-pitched, inhuman screams that pierced through the crackle of the fire and burrowed into my skull. It was as though whatever had been locked inside that box was now being released, its rage and pain pouring out into the world around me. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the screams only grew louder, more unbearable. They weren't just coming from the fire, they were inside my head, scratching at the walls of my mind. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my eyes squeezed shut as the noise drowned everything else out. Amidst the overwhelming noise, another sound reached my ears. Footsteps. I opened my eyes and saw it. The doll. It was here, at the edge of the firelight, bathed in the unnatural glow of the flames. Its porcelain face, once blank and expressionless, was now twisted into something grotesque, a demonic grin spreading across its delicate features. Its glass eyes, once dull, were alive with malice, reflecting the strange, shifting colors of the fire. The doll's small, delicate feet scraped against the floor as it took one slow, deliberate step toward me, and then another. Its limbs moved stiffly, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings, jerking with each step. But there was something else. It held a knife in its hand, a small, rusted blade that gleamed in the firelight. The doll's head tilted, as though it were studying me, savoring the moment. It took another step, faster this time, and then another, its feet tapping against the concrete in a rapid pace. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The screams from the fire were deafening now, swirling around me in a symphony of madness, and yet all I could focus on was the doll. Its lifeless eyes locked on mine as it came closer and closer. My back hit the wall, and the doll lunged. I screamed, throwing my hands up to block it, but the cold sting of the knife came faster than I could react. The blade pierced through my palm, tearing through flesh and bone, stopping just inches from my eye. Pain exploded through my arm as I tried to push the doll away, but its strength was unnatural, inhuman. Its porcelain face was frozen in that wicked grin. Its dead, glassy eyes locked on mine, and no matter how hard I fought, the doll pushed the knife closer to my face. I gasped, the edge of the rusted blade grazing my cheek, my muscles burning as I fought to keep it from plunging into my eye. Blood dripped down my arm, and I felt my strength slipping. The doll's grip tightened, relentless, as the blade inched forward. I could see nothing but that knife, feel nothing but the cold steel pressing closer and closer. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I kicked out at the doll, my foot connecting with its stiff, fragile body. It flew backward, its small frame catching on the edge of the flames. The fire roared to life, engulfing the doll in a wave of heat and light. For a split second, the doll froze, its grin faltering as the flames spread across its porcelain body. Then, as the fire surged higher, the doll crumbled, its delicate form disintegrating as it fell onto the box. The flames twisted violently, burning in unnatural colors, swirling like a storm as the doll's body was reduced to ash, scattering into the night like dust on the wind. The fire consumed the box, the screams growing louder, more horrifying with each passing second, until they finally peaked in one last shattering cry. And then, silence. The fire died down to a smoldering pile of ashes. The air was thick with smoke, the only sound the faint crackling of burning wood. My arm throbbed in pain, blood still dripping from my wound, but the box was gone, destroyed. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The box was gone. The damned doll and whispers were gone. It was finally over. As I drove home in the early morning light, the sun just beginning to creep over the horizon, I felt a strange emptiness settle over me. I had survived. I had destroyed the box. But I would never forget the screams or the way that doll had moved toward me, knife in hand. I never knew what was inside the box, and I don't ever want to know. The only thing I know for sure is that whatever was inside that box was evil. And I'll spend the rest of my life hoping it's gone for good. If you're still with us, brace yourself. The next story will test your courage. An angel wants to eat my heart. Bars have a lot of unwritten rules, unspoken rules, that are good to know. You might feel a little tense walking in, like you're being scrutinized or that you don't know what's happening. That's because you're in a kind of church. And that is what the feeling is like. They'll simplify it for you and say, don't talk about religion or politics, which seems obvious enough, but there's a longer list of things you don't discuss in bars. You shouldn't talk about finances, relationships, or family affairs either. In fact, the less you say, the better. Nobody is impressed by anything you say when you're in a bar. You make friends by listening while other people talk, and you'll soon find out you don't really want to hear what they have to say. That's how they feel about what you might want to discuss. You are boring, you are offensive, or you are self-absorbed. The worst is when you are nosy, too interested in what someone else has said. If you don't speak at all, everyone presumes there is something wrong with you. Being quiet and not talking is pretty rude. Then there is that guy who comes up next to you and says something that gets your attention, but then you realize you're being had for a pickup line. Will you be offended if he thinks he can have you for the price of a drink? If you don't care about yourself enough to be offended, you aren't worth his time, although he might be done hunting for the night and go for an easy kill. Being hard to kill just brings on bigger and meaner hunters. They will flatter you and convince you they are Mr. Right, except you're just the one who is left. It's just you. You're the only girl who hasn't gone home to sell herself for free to another drunken John. To the men in the bar, every woman there is for sale, and they are just haggling over a price. Some men have too much pride and don't want a free kill. Serial killers, all of them. Don't fall for the guy who seems innocent. He's the worst of them all. I'm sipping my drink slowly. Bars aren't where I go to find a new body for my closet. I'm not that kind of girl. No, my mama raised a prudent and wise woman, and I am here to learn. Gosh, I sure have learned a lot, and it breaks my heart to see how the game gets played. It's a little sickening, actually. But sometimes I think I am alone in that nauseating feeling. It's not that I don't enjoy intimacy. It's just that I prefer it has some kind of romantic meaning, some kind of expression of affection. Maybe even doing it for procreation, instead of just casual recreation. Even dogs have more purpose when they get it on and show more affection than these one-night couples who don't remember each other the next time they meet. Somewhere along the way, months or years later. I'm not a dog, although I get called the B word a lot by guys I resort to scorning when they are too persistent. I don't meet my lovers in bars. No, I'm better than that. At least I was until I met Mariel. I couldn't tell if Mariel was a man at all. He was so effeminate I actually thought, this is a lesbian. But Mariel was very patient and quite different. He wanted something different from me, and it wasn't like he was trolling the bar. It was more like he was doing what I was doing, just people watching. I just want to know what I am, as I am a person too. I just don't understand people, and bars have become a kind of school, a kind of temple, where I see it all on display. In a church, people just act like sheep, following the flock, pretending they are holy and charitable and faithful, or whatever they really are not. They are surrounded by a congregation, all wearing the same face, devoid of real emotions, playing nice for God and for their Sunday crew. I see the same people in the bar, on occasion, and that's their real face. In a church, they wear a mask, and they think God is judging them for their honesty when they confess, their sincerity when they sing, or their kindness when they tithe. God doesn't need our honesty. God knows what we are doing and why. God doesn't need our sincerity. We were made to rebel and to get lost. If God wanted obedience, there would be obedience. Do you really think God wants your money? I found more of God's countenance in the bars, despite my disgust. I was actually an atheist when I was dragged into churches by my family. It wasn't until I saw the real side of humanity that I realized that God is real. We don't discuss religion or politics in the bar because the bar is a place for truth. Nothing about religion or politics is honest. I looked over and saw the look on Mariel's face, and I knew he understood me. May I speak with you? He was asking without words. I nodded and he walked over to me like we had agreed to talk. He just sat beside me, and it felt nice to have someone next to me who knew what I was doing there. Aren't you going to say something? I asked him, after a few minutes of mutual silence. My name is Mariel. I'm just observing people. I saw you were doing that too. He said plainly. I started smiling. I was right about him. It felt really good. If he'd asked me to leave with him, I would have gone out the door with him. It felt weird, but I liked being able to let go of myself and feel safe, feeling that way. I'm Catherine. I can't believe you noticed me, I said awkwardly. It didn't matter. He seemed impressed. I'm trying to remember the rest of the conversation. It was deep and flattering. I felt really connected to him, and the hours just flew by. When the bar started to close, I couldn't believe how long we had sat there talking. I didn't want it to end, so I said, "Are you going to ask me to come home with you?" I must have sounded desperate, but he didn't shut me down. He just said, "It isn't your time yet," rather strangely and confidently. "But you have a good heart, and I won't let you out of my sight. I'm starved for a heart like yours." Okay. I stood up, embarrassed and feeling rejected. I wasn't sure if he'd shut me down, but it felt like he had, so I said, hearing myself, "So that's a no then. Let's just take this slow. We'll see each other again." He promised. I watched him get up and leave, without another word. We hadn't exchanged phone numbers, so it felt like he was just saying that. I am ashamed that I was a little bit drunk or emotional or something I can't even say, and I said as he left, "No, we won't. Goodbye, Mariel." Like I was having a little tantrum. That's another rule about bars. Don't take things personally. I'd somehow forgotten that one, which is weird considering how many guys I've asked to leave me alone and laughed at their immature reactions. But I did see him again. I came back to that same bar night after night, and I started to actually drink. The cost of the alcohol added up, and I'd let guys buy drinks for me. That went on for a while, and I would get pretty buzzed, trying to forget Mariel. Then one night, when I was actually considering going home with this seemingly nice guy, I saw Mariel again. He was just watching me. It felt creepy and rude, and I glared at him and then ignored him. The guy I was with saw how I was reacting to Mariel, and somehow ended up talking to him. Mariel seemed weak and timorous, but insisted on staring at me. The two of them ended up in a fight, and when the guy I was with got hit by Mariel, the guy fell down. "Catherine, I just wanted to check on you. I can see I've caused you some kind of harm. You've changed, haven't you? I don't want to wait. Will you come with me? I am starved for your heart." "Sure," I heard myself say. I walked out with him and found myself teetering in his arms. "I am going to eat your heart," he said, staring into my eyes. I almost laughed, but it felt like he was saying he was literally going to eat my heart. "Seriously?" I asked, feeling sudden dread. There was this grotesque look to him, this hungry sort of look, like a starved dog emerging from the darkness of an alleyway, baring its fangs, his smile. His eyes glinted too, in the dark we stood in. I shoved him away from me, but he grabbed me and held me with supernatural strength. "I can't let you go. You are too rare, and it's too hard to find someone with a pure heart." Mariel was holding me with one hand, and with the other he reached towards my breast, like he was going to do that thing from Indiana Jones when the priest reaches into the guy's chest and pulls out his heart. I screamed in terror and fought him off of me, surprising him so that he suddenly let go of me. I took off running from him. I looked back, and he was gone. Then there was a shadow over me, blocking the streetlight I was under. I looked up, and there was a blur of white feathers, like a giant seagull or something, except it was him. It was Mariel. He landed before me, blocking my escape up the street, folding his enormous white wings behind him, and then those same wings vanished. "What are you, some kind of vampire or something?" I asked, my voice high-pitched, trembling with fear. I was terrified, but the look on his face was conversational, and in a confused way, I was speaking to him instead of shrieking in outright terror. "I'm an angel, Catherine. I'm your angel, sent by God. I have a message for this world that I give to the pure of heart. Something changed when I met you. I remembered how hungry I am. I must feed. I need your sacrifice. I need to eat your heart." Mariel spoke calmly, hypnotically. I just stood there, shaking with fear, as though in a trance. I was in shock, I realized, but it also felt like I owed him my heart. I somehow wanted to cooperate with him, to just let him have it. It seemed like it would be easy to give in, to stop running, to not fight back, to just let him do what he wanted. Part of me was willing to surrender. "No," I stammered. Then, hearing my own voice, I shouted louder, again, and hit him with my thumb clenched in an unwieldy fist. I felt the bottom knuckle crack and pain shot from my hand into my wrist. I'd struck him hard enough to break my thumb. By the way, when making a fist, first roll your fingers tightly into a ball, then hold your thumb on the outside. When you direct a punch into a man's face, use your two innermost knuckles to connect and straighten your arm into a kind of snapping motion. Don't go for his jawbone or cheekbone, aim instead for his neck. That's way better self-defense for a girl outside a bar with a man refusing to leave her alone. I cried out in pain and saw I'd done no damage to him except maybe a slight bruise. The jolting pain, however, motivated me to run for my life. I ran from him, gripping my broken thumb in agony. "You cannot escape, I'll have you yet," I heard his voice saying from where he swooped above me in the darkness, his wings spread. I couldn't outrun him, so I ducked into an alleyway and tried to hide. "Don't bark at me," I said to a mangy old golden retriever that sat watching me where I hid from Mariel. "Catherine, where are you? Come out, I promise it won't hurt. I just want a little nibble." Mariel was coming into the alleyway, looking for me. He was walking, his wings too wide for between the buildings, and like before, when he folded them, they were invisible. "Leave her alone. She is terrified. You cannot have her." The dog suddenly spoke in a man's voice, much deeper and more masculine than Mariel's effeminate voice. "Stay out of this, Michael. She's mine," Mariel said to the mangy old golden retriever, who now stood between us. Michael started barking, and I wasn't sure if he had ever spoken. Mariel looked worried, as the dog seemed rabid or feral, barking ferociously. He looked to where I hid and said, "Someday I'll be back. You cannot hide from me." When he was gone, I went to the dog, who was calm again, and I hugged him. I took the dog home and fed him. The next day, I took him and got him cleaned up and set up an appointment at the vet. I got him a collar and named him Michael. I am not sure if he ever really spoke to me, but now I take good care of him. I come home to him every night, and he is always waiting for me patiently. He is a very good dog. He only barks when I am scared. I once asked Michael if he could speak, and he just shook his head no. He might just be an ordinary dog, but to me, he's my guardian angel. You survived that story, but what's waiting in the next one is much, much worse. Sometimes my girlfriend still meets up with her ex, and it feels wrong. When my girlfriend told me that she still hung out with her ex from time to time, I was shocked. Who wouldn't be, right? I mean, we'd been dating for a whole month and a half before she decided to drop the bomb on me. It obviously stung, but honestly, knowing what I know now, part of me wishes that I'd never found out. We were lying in my bed when she told me. I had my arms wrapped snugly around her waist, while some cheesy romance movie that I can't remember the name of droned on in the background. I don't know what made her think to tell me at that moment, but it put a damper on things, to say the least. "Joey, I have something that I need to tell you," Allie said, rolling over to face me. "Yeah? What's up?" I replied, staring deeply into her eyes. I was head over heels for that girl. I was fresh out of high school, and the way I saw it, Allie was my first real girlfriend. The only one worth putting in an effort for. So, I never could have anticipated what she told me next. "You remember my ex-boyfriend, Luke, right?" A pang of jealousy jolted through my chest upon hearing that name. "I think so. What about him?" Allie sighed, averting her gaze momentarily, before locking eyes with me once again. "I've kind of been meeting up with him, like, sorta regularly." I bolted upright, my mouth involuntarily falling open. My heart shattered into a million pieces, and I instantly assumed the worst. "Joey, please, let me explain. It's not what you think." "Allie, don't you think this is something that you should have mentioned sooner? We've been going on dates and shit for 4 months at this point, and you didn't think that was something you should have told me about?" She sat up to face me, her cheeks blossoming with color. Her bottom lip began to tremble, and I could see tears welling in her eyes. "This is why I didn't say anything. I knew you'd get all heartbroken and want to dump me. Just give me a chance to explain, please." I reluctantly glanced at her. The utter hurt and betrayal that I was feeling still hadn't completely dissipated, but the logical part of my brain had started to function. Maybe she really did have a good reason. "Okay, tell me. But I want the truth, all right? No more games." Allie vehemently nodded her head, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. She took a deep breath before responding. "So, lately I've been getting more into my religion. I decided to start going to church to get right with the Lord. But Luke is the pastor's son. I couldn't avoid him with how small this place is." I mulled it over for a moment, That wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. From the sound of it, they weren't seeing each other one-on-one, at least not with the way she'd framed the story. There's something else, too. Allie's hometown has a population of 32 people. I'd never really considered it, but being that small, it would probably be nearly impossible to stay under the radar. So you only see one another when you go to worship, like in a group. Yeah, that's why I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't think it was that big of a deal, she whimpered. I pursed my lips, continuing to think on it. If it wasn't a big deal, then why did she keep it from me for that long? If Allie didn't have anything to hide, then wouldn't she have wanted to tell me in order to avoid problems down the road? Her reasoning didn't make much sense, but either way, if something fishy was going on, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. All right, I believe you, I said. Allie instantly loosened up and she released a breath. But I want you to do something for me. Anything for you? I want to go to church with you, I blurted out, completely cutting her off. Allie's mouth was still agape, the remainder of her sentence dying on her lips. Really? Yeah, I've been a dirty sinner, and it wouldn't hurt to make amends with the big man upstairs, I replied, a grin inching across my lips. I was a staunch atheist, and Allie knew that, but hey, it's not like one visit to a chapel would cause me to burst into flames or anything, right? Allie giggled, her worried demeanor melting away. Okay, you can go with me to the Wednesday service tomorrow night, if you're free, you filthy heathen. Before I knew it, the time had arrived. I met Allie at her place, and we made the 15-minute walk down to the chapel. I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't a tad bit nervous. A small, crowded room with dozens of people who would immediately recognize me as an outsider didn't sound very appealing. But I'd gotten myself into that mess. It was up to me to deal with the consequences. So, is there anything I should know before we go in? It's been years since I've set foot in a church, I admitted, turning to my girlfriend for comfort as we approached the nearly empty parking lot. Nope, not really. Just sit there and enjoy the ride, Allie replied, winking at me. My heart fluttered. She was drop-dead gorgeous. Her makeup looked amazing, her hair was curled, and she wore a white, frilled dress that was a great match for her aesthetic. I was one lucky man, or so I thought. Once we finally reached the wooden double doors leading inside, I was a bundle of nerves. Sweat began to bead atop my brow, and my hands were getting clammy. I reached for the door handle to pull it open, but before I could, Allie grabbed my arm. Joey, it's all going to be okay. No need to worry. I'll be with you the entire time, all right? She said, flashing me a warm smile. That was one of the things I adored about my girlfriend. She always knew how to calm me down. Right? Thanks, babe, I said, swinging open the door and holding it for her. From the moment I entered the chapel, I could tell that something was off. Everyone in the room snapped their heads towards us and immediately directed their collective attention to me. My blood turned to ice, and my stomach twisted itself into knots. No one uttered a word. Their prying eyes just followed me around the room the whole way to my seat. Allie and I chose to sit in the back, for obvious reasons. I was immensely relieved when the parishioners directed their attention back to the preacher, who stood at the helm of the congregation. What the hell was that? I hissed under my breath as Allie settled into her seat. Oh, don't mind them. Just small-town drama. You know how that goes, she whispered into my ear. She did have a point. While Allie's town was microscopic, mine wasn't much bigger. A population of 215 isn't that big of a leap. In a little backwater town like that, gossiping was most people's favorite pastime. I directed my attention back to the podium, where the preacher had been joined by a young man, clad in a white robe. As he was the only other one remotely close to my age, I assumed that was Allie's ex. As much as it pains me to admit, the guy was handsome. He had a chiseled jawline that looked sharp enough to cut glass, his wavy, dirty blonde hair was cleanly cropped, and his deep blue eyes seemed to pierce through me every time they made contact with mine. I didn't hold a candle to him. Allie interlaced her fingers with mine and gave my hand a light squeeze. I found it comforting. Don't worry about him, okay? Just sit back and relax. Her voice was silky smooth. I turned to her and nodded, gripping her hand a bit tighter. Good evening, everyone, the preacher said, snapping my focus back to the altar. We will begin the service momentarily. But first, it appears that we have a guest. My name is Father Abrams. Welcome, young man. To my utter horror, the congregation again turned to face me. Their cold expression sent a chill running down my spine. No one but Father Abrams was smiling. And now, if you will kindly make your way to the front, we will start with the offertory, he said, taking the focus off of me. I breathed a sigh of relief. That relief was short-lived when I had a chance to soak in what he'd just said. The offertory already? I thought that was supposed to take place toward the end of the service. Why are we doing this now? I thought we were going to have to sing hymns and stuff first, I whispered as Allie and I rose from our seats. My church is different. Just go with it, Allie replied, tugging me into the aisle. I won't lie, I was mortified walking up to there. Dozens of people were crowded around a plate with a single loaf of homemade bread, their dead, unforgiving stares stabbing through me like daggers. Every instinct told me to run from that place and never look back. But I loved my girlfriend, so I stayed. Now I wish I would have listened to my gut. Let's begin. Everyone bow your heads. I did as I was told, eager to shake the feeling of being watched. Dear Heavenly Father, I humbly ask that you bless this bread and cup with your divine strength, so that we may better serve you. Let us walk in your holy light and live by your teachings. Amen. Amen. The congregation chanted in unison, startling me. I anxiously glanced up, only to find that all eyes were on me once again. The whole thing felt wrong. The prayer was too short. The people were too harsh. This didn't feel anything like a church should. But I foolishly told myself that I just needed to stick it out a little longer. Young man, come. Guests go first, Father Abrams said, his Cheshire smile making my skin crawl. I shot Allie a nervous glance before proceeding to the front. Luke stood beside his father, silver chalice in hand. He smirked as he extended it to me. I wanted nothing more than to slap that stupid grin off his face. Nevertheless, I took the chalice, peering at the dark red liquid inside before taking a swig. I grimaced as it traveled down my throat. It was thick and tasted metallic, coppery with a slight sweetness that confused my taste buds. That wasn't like any wine I'd ever had before. Luke then directed me to the loaf of bread. Take a piece, he whispered in a serpent-like tone. I glared at him as I complied. I tore off a tiny crumb and shoved it into my mouth before rejoining my girlfriend. I watched as each of the parishioners then took a piece of bread and nothing else. None of them drank from the chalice. A feeling of dread settled into my stomach as I began to feel nauseous. This couldn't be happening. Was I really? Before I even had a chance to process what was going on, the world began to spin violently, and everything went black. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the smiling faces of Allie and Father Abrams looming over me. I came to in a dingy, dimly lit room. I rubbed my head and surveyed my surroundings. I found myself in a basement, the only light emanating from several candles placed near the walls. Just what I'd been afraid of. I'd been drugged. A barrage of unwanted emotions hit me like a freight train. Betrayal, fear, confusion. They all coalesced inside me like a nauseating cocktail. Had Allie been lying to me the entire time we were together? Had this been the plan all along? I wasn't just going to take that lying down. I shot up, my vision still hazy, and took a good 3 steps forward. I face planted on the unforgiving concrete when I tried to advance further. It was only then that I noticed my ankle shackled to the wall. I was suddenly fearful for my life. Up until that point, it hadn't hit me how utterly screwed I was. But before I had a chance to process it, I heard footsteps descending into the basement. I squinted in the darkness, trying my best to see who was approaching. My heart dropped when I finally realized who it was. Father Abrams stood before me with Allie and Luke at his sides. Luke's arm was wrapped around Allie's waist, and she was leaning into him. White-hot rage bubbled within me at the sight of them. You tricked me, I growled, scowling at my now ex-girlfriend. And you fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. Hate to break it to you, babe, but Luke and I are still madly in love. She made a show of planting a sloppy kiss directly on his lips. I had never felt more hurt and betrayed in my entire life. Tears stung at the corners of my eyes, and my bottom lip began to quiver. Why? Why would you do that to me? I choked out through strangled sobs. Nothing personal, Allie cooed. You were just the easiest target. Yes, Joseph, Father Abrams chimed in, that same wide, malicious smile never leaving his lips. You see, some may deem it barbaric, but we, at the First Holy Church, believe that a human sacrifice is required to truly appease the Lord. And your blood will be ready in plenty of time for our Sunday service. They've left me down here. Father Abrams said they have some sort of ritual to do before taking my life. I've given up hope. I'm not sure if they know that I have my phone or not, but I don't think they care either way. Police response times are too slow to make it here before they get rid of the evidence. That or maybe the cops are in on it too. I'm really not sure. What I do know is that I don't have a very good chance of making it out of here alive. Hold your breath, because the next story will make your skin crawl. My friend went missing and I can't make sense of the message she left behind. Hopefully this is the right place for this, because I have no idea what else to do. The police are useless. No one I've talked to takes me seriously. I know this story sounds impossible, but something happened to my brother and my friend, and I need to figure out what it was and how to get them back. I am so scared something horrible has happened to them. The cops found this typed up on Steph's phone and asked me if I could explain it. I can't. It looks like she was trying to post it here, but couldn't get enough of a signal for it to go through. I'm posting it now to see if anyone can actually help, because I can't make any sense of it. I haven't changed a thing. I even left the typos in case I missed something important. Steph didn't mention the name of the town, and I won't either, because I don't think anyone should go looking for it. I certainly won't be going back anytime soon. Not unless I have to. Please, just read and help if you can. I'm sorry for any typos or if I leave stuff out. I'm trying to make this make sense, but I don't have long and it's getting hard to type. I hope somebody can tell me what's going on and how to stop it. I'm so fucking scared and I don't know what to do. I'm in this cabin in the mountains in Pennsylvania. I don't even know what this fucking place is called. I just followed my friend's directions. Please just help me. I'm supposed to be dog sitting for my friend's brother, but shit started going wrong pretty much immediately. My friend Amy, we're 26 now, but we've known each other since 6th grade. She knew I was strapped for cash, and she let me know her brother needed a dog sitter this weekend. I'm not really a dog person. There was an incident when I was a kid. I still have the scar to prove it. It took me for fucking ever to mostly move past it, but I need the money. And I won't lie, I've always kind of had a crush on her brother, so I jumped at the chance to get his number and maybe an in with him. What she failed to tell me is that her brother, Jason, lived in a creepy-ass cabin in the middle of the creepy-ass woods, in the creepy-ass mountains. I know it was rural, she'd said as much before, but I figured he was at least near a town of some kind. Nope. Miles from anything that could remotely be called a town. I probably should have guessed when Amy sent me typed-up directions instead of just giving me an address to plug into Google Maps. But I was relieved about the job and didn't ask questions. I'd been trundling along a dirt road for over an hour, maybe 2, wincing every time I hit an unavoidable pothole in my crappy old car before it happened. It was dark as hell. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of me, even with my high beams on. No streetlights, and the trees blocked every last scrap of moonlight. Anyway, I was creeping along, trying not to do any permanent damage to my car. I was munching on some of the French fries I'd picked up before I got off the highway. And thank God, since I doubted any pizza place would deliver out here, and I was too wiped to cook for myself. I had rolled a window down since my AC was on the fritz, and the weather was weirdly hot for this time of year. I always thought of the woods as quiet, but the noise was ungodly. The crickets were absolutely shrieking, to the point where I couldn't hear half of what was being said on the podcast I was listening to. It was honestly starting to creep me out, but I couldn't put the window up or I'd boil to death in the car. Then I heard what sounded like a scream, a human scream, and hit the brakes. I realized pretty quickly it couldn't be a person, not this far out in the wilderness, and on what must be Jason's private property. I knew some animals could make a sound like that. A fox? A mountain lion? Whatever it was, I didn't want to be anywhere near it. I hit the gas again. Something streaked across the road in front of me, and I slammed on the brakes and swerved, almost careening off the road in the process. I threw the car into park, my heart pounding, hacking up the French fry I'd been chewing. When I'd finally coughed it up and caught my breath, I heard the barking. I looked out, and there was a dog on the side of the road, barking and growling, hackles raised. It had a collar on, so it was clearly someone's pet, not anything wild. I was too scared to get out of the car in case the dog decided to lunge at me, so I rolled the window up until it was only open a crack and whistled. It took a few tries, but eventually the dog turned to look at me. Almost instantly, its demeanor changed. Ears went back, tail tucked between its legs. It crawled over to my car, jumping up and scratching at the window to be let in. That's when I saw the tag. It had the dog's name, Barney, printed on it, along with the owner's phone number. This was Jason's dog. I looked into the trees, wondering what he'd been barking at. Probably whatever I'd heard screaming. I needed to get out of here with Barney. I unbuckled myself, reached back and threw open the back door. Barney leapt in, panting and shaking, and I slammed the door shut. The dog whipped around to look at me, and I swear for a second he looked ready to attack. But he sniffed my hand and calmed down again, laying down on the back seat. I turned and took off again, hands shaking. I turned a corner and saw Jason's house. On top, I saw the silhouette of what appeared to be a large fallen tree limb with gnarled branches sticking out in every direction. But the house was in a large clearing, no trees nearby. It wasn't until I pulled up closer to the house that I realized what it was. A mass of antennas and satellite dishes covering basically the whole top of the house, with cables stretched and twisted between them to form one haphazard mass, making the whole thing look like the floor of an untamed jungle. What the fuck could that be for? Was that how Jason had an internet connection out here? Or was he losing his mind from the isolation and building his own techie version of the Sarah Winchester house at the instructions of the ghosts in his head? Can't say I'd blame him if he was, being out here by himself. All the lights were on, and I could see his car parked around the side of the cabin. And, right in front of me, I saw the front door open wide. Immediately, a million different horrifying scenarios run through my mind. Did Jason have some kind of terrible accident? A heart attack? And run from the house for help? Did someone break in? Could that have been him screaming in the trees? I checked my phone. No bars out here. I knew Jason must have Wi-Fi because he worked remotely from up here, but it must not extend outside. I glanced at my mirror. Barney was quiet and still now, but his eyes were wide open, watching me intently. Sighing, I got out of the car, walked up to the porch. I glanced through the open door, standing way back. Everything looked okay from out here. I took one tentative step over the threshold. Still nothing out of place. No signs of a struggle. The furniture was all upright and where it should be. Jason's big screen TV and expensive-looking speakers were still there, and his car keys sat on the dining room table, so I doubted it was burglars. I was still fucking freaked, though. Next to the fireplace, a glass front cabinet contained a number of rifles. I thought having one might make me feel safer, but I had no idea how to use one, or even where Jason kept ammunition, so they were useless to me. Then my eyes moved to the fireplace, where 2 axes were mounted over the mantel. Perfect. I took one down. It was heavier than I expected, but it would have to do. I went from room to room quietly as I could, but everything looked normal. Finally, I made my to Jason's office. My heart was practically beating through my chest now. I turned the knob and pushed it open half an inch. I used both hands to hold the axe over my head, ready to strike, then kicked the door open and jumped back. The room was pitch black, perfectly dark. Somehow the light from the hallway didn't seem to seep in there at all. Someone could be hiding out in there and I'd have no way of knowing. I tried to think what to do. "Hey," I said, "the cops are on their way, so you better not do anything stupid. Just stay back, or you're in deep shit." My voice sounded high-pitched and shaky, not intimidating like I'd hoped. I inched forward and, against my better judgment, reached inside the doorframe to search for a light switch, holding the axe awkwardly in my other hand. Any second I expected something to reach out and grab me and yank me into the yawning black. But it didn't. I found the light, switched it on. The light, first of all, was weird. dense and orange-brown so that I could barely see even with it on. Inside the room, there was no one. But this place was weird as shit. I'd expected a desk, a chair, a computer, normal office stuff. There were a bunch of computer monitor, maybe a dozen, more, on a series of folding tables that wrapped around the room. Under the tables, a bunch of processors were stacked horizontally on top of one another, basically as many as could physically fit down there. And everything was connected with a tangle of cords and wires, some of which ran up the wall and into the ceiling. One long cord stretched out of this mess and connected to a cube sitting in the center of the room on the floor. Nothing appeared to be on, but I could hear a dull buzzing, so maybe it was all just asleep. Setting down the axe outside the door, I took a few steps inside. I assumed the cube thing controlled it all, so I kneeled down to look at it. There were no buttons or anything obvious to press. Maybe it worked like a trackpad? I reached out for it, and a pins and needles sensation started in my fingertips. I guess I should have stopped then, but, well, I didn't. I touched it with the tips of my fingers. Everything awoke at once. A screeching sound shot out from behind the far wall of processors, nearly deafening me before I could clap my hands over my ears. The monitors, somehow they turned blacker, a darker dark that made my eyes ache, before rows and rows of green text scrolled rapidly down each of the screens. As far as I could tell, it looked like just random symbols, not any language I recognized. I crept closer to get a better look, and then all of it stopped. Silence crashed down over me, and the screens went blank. Cringing, I gave the cube a few tentative pokes, but nothing happened this time. Even the buzzing had quieted. My fingers still felt like they were vibrating, though. What the fuck? I rose to my feet with difficulty, as my legs were wobbling beneath me. I shook my hand in a futile attempt to get rid of that vibrating feeling, then pulled out my phone. My signal was strong here, so tried to call Jason, but my calls wouldn't connect. I don't mean it went straight to voicemail. I mean it made this horrible screechy sound that I guess means the number has been disconnected. For a moment, I thought the computers had turned back on, but no, it was just my phone. I tried texting him too, but those bounced right back. So I called Amy. Hey Steph, did you get there okay? Well, yes, but I think something's wrong. Jason's not here. What do you mean? Asked Amy. I mean, I drove up here, Barney was out running loose, and the cabin door was wide open, but no Jason inside. A long pause. Are you sure? Amy, I checked the whole place. He's gone. Nothing's out of place. I don't think he was hurt or anything, but he's not here. Did you call him? I can't get through. Okay, I'll call the friends he's supposed to meet up with. Maybe he's with them. I think maybe I should call the police. I don't. She stopped suddenly. Amy? No response. I checked my phone. The call had been cut off. No signal. Great. I walked out of the office to check on Barney, and the office door slammed shut behind me. I screamed and fell to the floor. I lay there for a long time, too scared to look behind me. Finally, I stood up and tried the door, but it was firmly locked. I leaned my full weight into it, but it wouldn't budge. I should have left. I know that. But slowly, methodically, I convinced myself that everything had a logical explanation. Jason had left the house in a hurry because there'd been an emergency. Whatever was fucking up the signal on my phone must have fucked his too. That's why he hadn't called or texted. His car was here, but, well, maybe he had a second one? Or a motorcycle or something? Or someone picked him up? The office, well, that was weird. Maybe Jowson was running some kind of experiment. That would explain the shit on the roof too. Or maybe I was right earlier and he was kind of losing it, being all alone up here. And the door, the wind must have blown it shut. But there had been no window in there. Fuck it. The AC must have switched on, blown the door shut, and jammed it somehow. I calmed a little and went to call Amy back, but I had no service. Oh well. Nothing I could do about it now. Eventually I explained away all of it. Part of me was still scared, but what was I going to do? Run away from here? Run from nothing and no one. I went out to the car to collect Barney and my things, looking around me for any kind of threat. I had to drag the dog back to the house. He kept staring and growling at the tree line. Had the mountain lion or whatever followed us back? This whole thing was really unnerving, and I started second-guessing my decision to stay, but I didn't want to wind my way back down the mountain in the pitch dark with a pissed-off dog in tow. I'd stay here till morning, and leave then if I needed. Maybe by then, Amy would have figured out that Jason is fine. Maybe the dog would be back to normal. Maybe this gig wouldn't be a total shit show. I shook my hand again. That pins and needles feeling just would not subside. And then I fed the dog, poured myself a large glass of the wine I'd brought, and sat down to watch some TV and finish my French fries. The cable up here was not much better than the cell service, it turned out. The signal was fuzzy and kept cutting out. Finally, I gave up and rummaged through the stacks of DVDs next to the couch. He had almost nothing I liked. Almost all thrillers and horror. How he managed to watch these things up here all by himself, I do not understand. But I found some sci-fi thing that didn't seem too scary, so I popped it into the DVD player and sat down to watch it. I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke to the sound of Barney growling. I sat bolt upright and saw him standing at the door, baring his teeth, ready to attack. Oh, buddy, not again? I stood up and looked out the window. Nothing. Just trees and dark. Barney had quieted down again. I realized I need to let the dog out before bed. I clipped on his collar and leash and started to walk outside, but grabbed the axe on my way out. Just in case. Nothing happened to us. Barney did not so much as glance up at the trees, just did his business and went back inside. Whatever had been stalking us must have given up. I turned off the movie and went to brush my teeth, feeling much more relaxed than I had just a few minutes ago. If it weren't for the fucking vibrating it had spread to the fingers on my other hand now, I'd have felt completely at peace. When I came out of the bathroom, I noticed something on the floor that I hadn't seen before. It was a piece of paper, like torn off from a paper bag, with a few words scrawled on it in messy handwriting. Sorry, have to go. I stared at it, confused for a moment, and then suddenly overcome with rage. Sorry? Have to go? Was Jason serious? He couldn't have at least closed the door behind him and sent me a text. I snatched the paper off the ground. It was clearly torn off and written in a rush. Maybe he'd had an emergency and had no time to think things through. But then why was his car still here? Who knew? Who fucking cared? I crumpled up the note and hurled it at the trash can across the room. Right at that moment, Barney went ballistic. Fucking dog. I stormed out to the living room to see what the hell he was up to now. He was barking at the closet, the coat closet, to the right of the fireplace. What the fuck? I approached the dog, my sense of dread growing stronger by the second. I picked up the axe I'd set down earlier, just in case. I reached for the door handle. Barney backed away, tail between his legs. I pulled the door open. Nothing. Totally normal closet. Some coats hanging up, a pair of muddy boots on the floor. The vibrating in my hands was getting worse though. But wait, back in that corner. What? The wall shouldn't extend that far. It just shouldn't. It would cut off the hallway on the other side. What the fuck? I stepped inside and was instantly hit with a wave of nausea so severe it brought me to my knees. When I was bent down, I saw further back into the far corner. Past the coats. Black. Deep, dark, soul-sucking black. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. A growl. I whipped around, fighting the urge to puke. Barney stood a few feet back from the door, poised to attack, snarling, hackles all the way up from neck to tail. Whoa, I said, trying to sound calm. It's okay, buddy. He lunged, coming straight at me. Without thinking, I reached forward and slammed the door shut. More silence. Barney? I reached for the handle. It wasn't there. I felt around for it, but it was nowhere. The door frame was gone too. No. I felt around frantically, hoping I'd just step to the side a little without noticing. I felt all along the wall, but nothing. I let out a terrified sob. Then, on the back of my neck, a breath. I screamed and fell and just kept falling. I awoke in perfect darkness. The ground was cold and hard, the air perfectly still. I sat up, expecting pain, but I felt fine. Except for those fucking pins and needles. I looked around helplessly, eyes wide open but unseeing in the vast black. Then I felt something hard digging into my hip. My phone. I still had my phone. I yanked it out, and it was mercifully unbroken and still partially charged. But the image on the screen was fucked up. It was like someone had shattered it and shoved the pieces haphazardly back together. It had never seen it do that before. I had never seen any phone do that before. I touched the screen, right in the center. and it started screaming. White noise, shrieking at me, like the phone was alive and in agony. On the screen, circles rippled frantically away from my thumb, as though trying to escape. I dropped the phone and the noise stopped. And immediately I regretted it. Getting that phone to work might be my only way out. Or maybe I'd find a way out and need to call for help. I knelt down and felt around the ground by my feet. After a minute, I started to panic that it had bounced away, but no, there it was. I tucked it back into my pocket. When I stood, my hand brushed something solid and I jerked back, hitting a wall behind me. A wall. So this place wasn't endless. I reached out in front of me, took a few steps forward, and yes, another wall. To my right, a wall. I reached out to my left, took a few steps. Nothing. That way was open. Maybe there was a way out of here. A few more steps, and my toe bumped something solid, heavy. I bent down, felt around with my hand, the axe. It had come with me too. I gripped it tight and stood. I walked a bit further, shuffling because I was still blind. I would bump the left wall, then try to straighten out, then shuffle for a bit longer and bump the right wall. It was clear before long that this was a tunnel. I don't know how long I continued like that, in the dark. It felt endless. And it was getting colder, colder all the time. I was constantly terrified that I would suddenly drop off a cliff or run into something dangerous or find the end of this place and realize that I was truly trapped. And then, a light up ahead, more like a glow than a bright light, like the sun just starting to peek up over the horizon. I quickened my pace, bashing into the walls a couple of times. Colder and colder. As I got closer to the light, I realized it wasn't a single point. The light was coming from distinct points on either side of the tunnel. I was too far to say for sure, but I thought they looked like doorways. As I got closer, my suspicion was confirmed. Doorways staggered along both sides of the tunnel, harsh glowing light spilling from each of them. I approached the first one, shivering now. I looked through the doorway and felt the hope drain from me. It was static, like on a TV. White and glowy and fuzzy, a buzzing sound in the background. If I looked hard enough, I thought I could see movement behind it, but that could have just been my imagination, or my eyes playing tricks after so long in the dark. The vibrating in my hands was stronger here. I made my way to the next one, more of the same. Then my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I yanked it out, praying that someone was calling, someone who could help. But no, it was just more ripples, though this time it was happening without me touching the screen. The white noise was back, but quieter, matching the tone of the doorways. I put the phone back in my pocket. I took one tentative step toward the door, then another. I reached a hand out toward it, but as my fingers inched forward, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I tried to push through it, but then the static did that rippling thing and it pushed back. It was like it was trying to repel me. Finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, I yanked my arm back. I dropped to the ground and started to cry, despair weighing me down. There was no way out. I sobbed and sobbed until I wore myself out, and then I just laid there, staring up at nothing. The dread feeling slowly faded. I stood up and looked further down the tunnel. There were doors as far as I could see, alternating on either side. They all appeared to frame the same static as the first one. There was nothing else I could do. I kept walking. At first, I looked closely at each doorway, trying to see if I could glean any meaning from them. But after a while, I grew tired of it and gave up. I kept my gaze forward and trudged along for I don't know how long, until my legs started to ache with the effort. But then, I noticed shapes in the static. At first I thought I was imagining it, that I'd spent too long in the dark and my mind was inventing things for me to see. But then the shapes were too defined to dismiss. I couldn't make out what they were doing, but there were definitely people moving around in there. I tried to call to them, but they didn't seem to notice. I walked closer to one of them, hoping this time I might make it through, but the dread and the static pushed me back again. And then I could hear them. Almost imperceptible at first, but growing just a bit louder at each doorway. And then I could see scenes playing out. A man and a woman screaming at each other, their faces inches apart. I ducked away instinctively, as though any second they might turn on me. A creature, a dog, lunging at the doorway. That one made me jump back in terror, fearing for a second that it might be able to pass through. It didn't, though. It just disappeared and started over again a moment later. And the next one, a little girl, sitting on the ground, hunched over herself, shaking. It took me a second to realize she was crying, sobbing. I felt strangely connected to her, like I could feel what she was feeling. I didn't have to get close this time. The dread slammed into me, and I cried out. "Hello?" I said to the girl. "Can you hear me?" She just kept crying. She had no idea I was there. I collapsed, exhausted. How long had I been down here? Minutes? Hours? I couldn't keep going, but I couldn't sleep when I felt like this. I used the last of my remaining energy to crawl a little further, so I was an equal distance from the last door and the next. The dread wasn't gone here, but it was bearable. In any case, it weighed me to the spot. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. I shut my eyes. I shot up to my feet in an instant, a scream reverberating through my head. I had slept, no idea how long, but this wasn't a dream. It was real, and it wasn't muffled like the doorway sounds. It stopped. I had no idea which direction it had come from. I stopped and listened closely, but there was nothing now. My heart was pounding, fear and adrenaline pumping through me, and I knew I wasn't going back to sleep. I took up my journey again, faster now. The blurry scenes continued. The dread pressed in on me, forcing me to the middle of the tunnel. And as I walked and walked, glancing now and then at the doorways, I noticed something about the sneeze. Maybe it was because they were becoming clearer, or because I'd been in here among them for so long, but they were familiar. I hadn't wanted to admit it at the time. I couldn't think clearly anyway. But that little girl, I knew her. I was her. And I remembered that moment. I'd just come home from school, and my mom had sat me down, stony-faced, and told me that our cat had died. I had cried all night and the next day, and for days after she died. And the two people arguing, I couldn't see them clearly, but I'm almost certain they were my parents. They'd had so many screaming matches just like that before we left. The neighbor's dog, slipping his leash and attacking me. I still had that scar on my right arm. And there I was again, sitting alone at a lunch table, trying desperately not to cry. Climbing a tree, then the ground rushing up at me, a group of girls surrounding me, laughing, pushing me down. I didn't know what this place was, or how it knew, or where it got my memories. But it was clear by now. It was playing back the worst moments of my life, and I was trapped in here with them. And I knew it was only going to get worse. If I wanted to ever get out of here, I had to keep going through. I tried to keep my eyes down on the path in front of me, but it didn't help. I could still hear my cries, my screams. Lost as I was in my despair, it took me longer than it should have to notice. Footsteps. Like the scream before, I knew they were real. They were not muffled like the doorways. They were clear and real and terrible, and they were coming from the direction I had just come from. I had to hurry. I didn't want to meet what lived down here. I started to jog. As I tried to put space between myself and the footsteps, the scenes grew clearer and more intense. My mom pulling me from my bed in the middle of the night and dragging me out to the car, no explanation, with nothing but the clothes we had on. I never saw my childhood home again. The footsteps are closer. I start to flat out run. Still, I could see the scenes playing out on either side of me. Another doorway, a hand lurching out for my neck. I screamed and tried not to look. And then, ahead, a light. Not like the doorways, not a white glare. It was warm and soft, and it was straight ahead. My muscles were screaming in pain at this point, but I sped up, listening to the footsteps get closer all the time. The static sound got louder and louder, occasional screams and cries piercing through it. I was almost there when I noticed a dark figure in the light. Just standing there, staring. I stopped for a moment, unsure, but the footsteps were still hunting me. I thought I could hear yelling from that way. Not the muffled kind from the doorways, a real, live voice. There was no choice. I took off again, ready to meet my fate in the light. As I got closer, the figure began to take shape. A large man, draped in shadow behind him, blinding me to his futures. I locked eyes with him, or at least imagined I did. He shouted something, and I raised the axe high and ran at him. I was almost there, steps away, when he lunged forward, hands outstretched. I screamed and swung the axe. It struck with a sickening thud, and the figure fell back into the light. He laid perfectly still, a dark pool forming around him. I stepped forward into the light and screamed. The axe clunked to the ground beside me. I knelt down to confirm the horrible fact I already knew. Before me lay Jason, the life already gone from his eyes. His skin was ice white, his neck was half severed from his shoulders. He was dead. I had murdered someone. The thought raced around my mind, but I could not make it real. The footsteps, they were still coming, almost here. Suddenly, violently, I vomited, but I couldn't stop. I had to go. The footsteps were pounding now, the yelling louder, bouncing off the walls and whirring together with the static. Going against all my instincts, I looked over my shoulder for the source of the footsteps. I recoiled in horror at the sight. It was a human-shaped thing made of static, with human features flashing through every few seconds. A hand, an eye, a length of hair, and running straight at me, arms flailing, feet pounding, voice shrieking incoherently between patches of static, like a radio station going in and out of range. Everything in me was repelled by this absolute monstrosity. Sobbing, I stumbled over Jason's body, slipping and coating myself in his blood. With one last scream, I pulled myself out onto the porch. I turned over and looked back. The tunnel was gone, along with the body, the evidence of my crime. I crumpled to the ground and gasped with relief, the full horror of what I'd done yet to wash over me. The vibrating in my hands was painful now, like pins and needles after I'd been laying on my arms for hours. I shook and shook them, but it didn't help. And then a shadow to my left and a growl. I leapt up. Before me stood an angry beast, teeth bared and hackles up, inching toward me. "Barney," I said, my voice trembling. "It's okay, buddy. It's me. You know me." He lunged, and I leap over the porch railing, falling hard on my side. I groped around for the axe, but of course it was gone, lost to the tunnel. I stumbled to my feet and tried to run for my car. The key was somehow, miraculously still in my pocket, but it wasn't there. I stood frozen for a second, but the dog was coming, so I sprinted for the trees as the raging dog leapt over the railing and chased after me. I entered the woods, running as fast as I could as branches and thorns tear at my clothes and skin. I could hear the dog's growls just feet behind me. I had no idea which direction I'm running in until I stumble onto the dirt road and nearly fall over. I took a moment to catch my breath, but the dog was at my heels. I bolted into the woods on the other side. My foot caught on a tree root, and I crashed into the ground, face first. I cried out in agony, scraping my tongue along the now cracked teeth in my mouth. I could hear the dog on the road now, coming straight for me. But then, a flash of lights and the squeal of brakes. I considered crawling over, calling out, but then I remembered the blood on my clothes. What could I say? Then I heard a whistle. And another. And another. The dog stops growling, whimpers instead. I heard a car door open and slam shut again, and that's when I realized. I ran onto the road just as the car was pulling away. My car. It rolls away into the dark. What the fuck? I follow Ed the car, stopping just before I emerge from the trees. I can feel the night's wear on my muscles now that I've slowed. My limbs are so heavy. I'm so tired. I watched myself emerge from the car, and it's all I can do not to pass out. I lean against a tree and let myself sink to the dirt. There's a soft static sound echoing in my head now. My other self ushered the dog inside and closes the door. I sat there, gasping for air, lost in my own horror and confusion, for I don't know how long. I think I passed out. I came to myself eventually. The front door was shut, and I think Barney is gone from the car. The vibration has spread up my arms and into my shoulders, and I know what it is now. It's the static. It's in me now, in my head. Ever since I touched the cube. I remembered my phone. I pulled it out, fumbling it at first because my hands won't stop vibrating. It was no longer spasming, but I still had no signal. At some point, though, I must have had one, because I have 8 missed calls. All from Amy. She left a few voicemails of varying lengths, but they wouldn't load. One text got through. "Where are you? Please pick up." I had to get out of here. I had no idea where I'd go or what I'd do. No idea how I could live in a world where there are 2 of me. But I had got to do something. I had to figure out how to get rid of this static, this infection somehow. I still had my car key in my back pocket. I watched the windows for a minute. No sign of other me. I creeped toward my car, key in hand, keeping low to the ground. As I got closer, I could hear Barney barking and grumbling inside. I unlocked the door and crawl inside, shut the door. just in time. The cabin door swung open and other me walked out with the dog. I ducked down so they wouldn't see until, hey, we're gone again. And then I just sat there. I knew I need to go. I wanted to go. But my stupid fucking limbs wouldn't move. I couldn't stop thinking about the sickening thud the axe made when it connected with skin and bone. My hands shook. I wanted to throw up, but there was nothing in me to come out. I could see the static then, patches of it, forming on my hands and arms, undulating and slowly spreading. Fuck. I realized that the other one, has disappeared from the window. I must have gone to brush my teeth. Maybe if I can get in there and stop myself from ever going into that closet, then Jason won't be dead. Fuck it. I had to try. Slowly, quietly, I pushed the car door open and crawled toward the house. I wince as the front door creaks, but other me didn't notice. I stood and looked around. That's when I noticed my empty fast food bag resting on top of the trash. A white paper bag. Fuck. It was me. Future me. The note, I snatch it out of there and stare at it helplessly. What was I trying to say? Sorry, I have to go. What? I snatched a pen off the counter and tore off a strip of paper and started scribbling, hoping I'd figure out the note as I go, but my hands and arms shook so bad and I could hardly feel them. And then I got to the word go, and then I heard the bathroom door creak open. I dropped the note and backed into the living room. Barney had been fast asleep, but he opened his eyes. Slowly, he raised his head, his eyes becoming angrier by the second, and his mouth curled up in a snarl and he was barking. I bolted to the closet just in time, slipping behind the door just as other me emerges from the kitchen. I ducked behind the coats and felt around in the corner for the black hole, hoping I could block me from going down there, but it wasn't there. It was just closet. Other me enters and everything changes. The shrieking sound from the tunnels is back, but it's in my head and it paralyzes me as I feel the yawning gap open up beside me. Other me leans forward to inspect it, stares deep into it, and I can't help it. My breath brushes the back of her neck. She screams and falls and is gone. The gap is still open. I can move again, but I am vibrating all over. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I need to hurry if I'm going to stop her, and the static is in my gut now. My heart, it's going everywhere, but I need someone to know where I've gone and why, and maybe you can stop it. Don't come here, just stop it. I've got to go, whoa, sorry. Oh. That's it. The police said she was probably just writing a story, since the events here can't possibly be true. They have no explanation for why the phone was on the floor in the closet, or why the note was still there in the trash, or where Steph had gone. What? She just wandered into the woods in the middle of the night, in a strange place, without the dog or any of her stuff? And where's Jason? They looked for traces of my brother's blood on and around the porch, but found nothing. It was raining by then, though, so who knows? The computers and the stuff on the roof is still here, but it doesn't seem to do anything. I touched the cube too, before I read Steph's message, and nothing turned on, but I think I felt a jolt in my fingers. I hope that was just nerves. The Wi-Fi was working fine. Steph's phone worked fine. The parts about her conversations with me are all true. I sent Steph's story to myself before I handed the phone back to the police. I brought Barney home with me. He's not hurt, but he's pretty shaken up. When we arrived, he ran straight to a corner of the living room and has been cowering there ever since. I keep bringing him food and water, but he barely touches it. He won't sleep, and I have to drag him outside for bathroom breaks. He also keeps staring at the door to my garage, alternately whining and growling. I've checked, and I hope I'm imagining it, but I don't think so. I think I see a shadow in the corner where there's never been one. I tried to approach, but I thought I could feel tingling in my fingertips. It feels like static. I got out of there, and I locked and barricaded the garage door. Please help. If you think that was bad, just wait until you hear what happens next. The pole man. That's what I call him, although he's neither a man nor a pole. I understand there may be a few of you who think it's a silly title for what very well may be a monster or demonic entity, but it makes sense and it doesn't need some epic name anyhow. It's not some magnificent beast of legend, rather, it's an unnerving cryptid that's actually quite benevolent if you don't notice it, or him. I first saw him walking down the street one night. My part of the city is in the slums. I'm a factory worker, making pennies trying to save up for college to make something of myself. And the rent there was cheap. The streets there are filled with abandoned buildings, graffitied with boarded-up windows. And the streets themselves are a Frankenstein mash of cobblestone from the 19th century and modern asphalt, because the city thought it was good for tourists here for the history, and also didn't want to pay money to completely fix it. Even as a man, I felt unsafe walking around at night, and carried a switchblade with me because I couldn't afford a gun. However, my anxiety about being mugged didn't outweigh my desire for a late-night convenience store run. My check had come through on my bank account extremely late, and the little store up the street has hot dogs rolling under heat lamps, chips, and energy drinks, all perfect for a midnight movie binge. I couldn't sleep, thinking about how much I hated our economy and despised capitalism, how much more I had to save to go to college, and to cheer myself up, I was going to watch some horror flick classics until I passed out at the crack of dawn. So, I was on my way towards that little convenience store, pulling my jacket tighter over me as a gust of autumnal wind blew through, when I noticed it. One of the many telephone poles which cluttered the area looked different than the rest. I can't fully explain it. It was just off. Like an extremely difficult game of spot the difference. There were a couple of broken and flickering lampposts on this block, and the tops of the telephone poles were heavily shadowed as they towered above the orbs of yellow glow the posts emanated. Their wires branched out, weaving in between rooftops, connecting to each other like a web. Of course, I wasn't going to puzzle and ponder over a utility pole, so I kept walking, reaching the middle of the street where it was. I bustled past it, my hands shoved into my pockets for warmth, and I only made it a few steps before I stopped in my tracks. I had heard a creak, just barely noticeable under the blanket of nighttime noise, like the sound of cars honking and driving on a busier road some miles away, and distant police sirens. Now, my first thought was, holy shit, is this thing ready to fall on me? I turned around and looked up at it, while continuing to back away. That's when I realized that it wasn't a utility pole at all. It was a living, breathing creature which looked identical to one. The part of the pole, which was shadowed heavily, had two glowing pinpoints for eyes which stared down at me with a strange sense of intelligence. The wires, or whatever they were, which branched out from what may have been his head, quivered and twitched as if they were limbs, something I hadn't noticed before. Two of those limbs disconnected from the wires they were mimicking and hung down at his sides, making it clear they were black, tendril-like arms. The reason I call it a he is because he moaned in a gravelly voice that sounded masculine, like an ancient man disturbed from his deep slumber. Then, he leaned his misshapen head forward, lifting a wiry arm towards me, and I finally broke into a run, and I didn't stop until I reached the convenience store, which glowed like a Christmas tree on the otherwise dark curb. The man behind the counter gave me a weird look as I entered. Breathless and terrified, I ignored his gaze and wandered about the store, trying to process what I'd seen. I noticed the man behind the counter was eyeing me warily, probably thinking I was some junkie tweaking out, and he seemed on the verge of telling me to leave. I told myself that I was hallucinating from lack of sleep, and gathered up the items I had come for. I checked out at the register and left with my food in a little white bag swinging next to my thigh. Jesus Christ, I didn't want to walk down that street again, so I went out of my way to find a different route, which would take me longer to get back to my apartment. So yeah, I went the opposite direction and turned down a street I'd never used before, planning to get back to the street my apartment complex was on without passing that same pole again. I was almost home, and I could almost taste the cheap junk food and feel the warm comfort of my bed as I snacked and watched TV. I just wanted to stay awake until dawn. I wanted to be in the safety of my apartment, and I was almost there. But of course, it wouldn't be so simple. I heard a low moan, which sounded like misery and unrest, and I looked up and saw that the utility pole on the curb of the right-hand side of the street up ahead was actually the pole man again. He stood out more than he did before. There was no brown wood, just a weird black cylindrical body with many arms and hairs as thin as wires. Its head was like a hammer shape, sprouting long hairs, and its eyes glowed yellow like the lampposts. His stare was fixed solely on me. He was big and overwhelmingly tall, and the only thing he wanted to focus on was me, which felt like being a lone insect singled out by that one sadistic kid who liked to rip the legs off bugs. There was no one else on this street, and the windows of the few shoddy-looking houses on this block were black, letting me know everyone was fast asleep. The look we gave each other was like the stare down of a predator, and it's pretty. I looked at him with total fear and confusion, wondering if I was losing my mind, and he looked at me with something I could only describe as hatred. It didn't have any expression, at least not from what I could see standing where I was, but I could feel it. Like how you feel someone's eyes on you from across a room. Feel them burning holes into the back of your head. This thing, I got the feeling that he didn't want to be noticed, and now that I had noticed him the first time around, he was going to notice me in return. But his attention would be malicious, unlike mine. He stood there in the dim lighting, still looking like a silhouette as if he was covered in darkness, and it felt like he was a sentinel whose only purpose was to ensure I didn't make it past him. So I turned and ran back, attempting to go the original route and retrace my initial steps from the convenience store. I ran past the store and down a block, turning and feeling hope shine inside me like a beacon, as I knew I only had 2 blocks left to go. I felt something thin and wiry brush along my back and screamed, propelling myself forward and running even faster than I thought possible. I dropped the bag in my hand and didn't even look behind me. I didn't need to look behind me to know that I was so hell-bent on getting back home that I forgot to survey the street for the pole man and had inadvertently ran right under him. His touch burned like an extremely scorching hot light bulb grazing my skin, and then it itched something fierce, like 1,000 mosquito bites. I turned the final corner and saw my apartment complex standing at the end of the street, but he was also there, right across from it, looking for all the world like a thick vertical black line with fine tendrils wriggling and waving in the air. He now swayed gently side to side like a tree. The more I looked at him, the more angry he seemed to get, swaying even more violently and moaning like a disturbed animal. But I was damned if I was going to stay out in the street all night. I ducked out of sight, behind a building, and made my way to my complex's back door through the back alleys. I punched in numbers in a keypad and went straight for my front door on the 3rd floor, and the first thing I did was close every curtain inside. My living room and bedroom window faced the street, and I yanked those drapes shut before I even gave myself a chance to look at him again. Although I couldn't afford to, I took a few sick days, too afraid to step outside even during the daytime. I didn't end up watching any horror movies. I watched light-hearted comedies and romances instead as I tried to scrub the image of that monster out of my mind. I have no idea what it was or what it wanted. Well, I suppose it wanted to go unnoticed, if anything. But what it was doing in the urban area of a city, I have no clue. But that was the last encounter I actually had with it, and it left me with an angry red imprint on my back, like someone had whipped me with a wire. I moved into a better area in a month, rooming with someone so it wouldn't be too expensive. And once in a blue moon, the few times I must go out at night, I do hear the solemn creaks of a utility pole looming just out of my line of sight. Instead of looking directly towards the sound, though, I decide not to give him any sort of unwanted attention. So if you ever experience something like this, I implore you to do the same, and not look into things too hard when you're alone and it's dark and eerie outside. I just believe some things in this world were simply not meant to be perceived, and the pole man is one of them.